So hey guys. Welcome back to my channel. This is part 1. What if Naruto fell in love with the angel who lost her wings? Basically, Naruto helps her to find her lost wings in the shinobi world. But luckily both of them fell in love during the journey. But who was this angel and where did she come from? You guys will know after listening to the story. So, before we start, please do like and subscribe to the channel. And press the bell icon on. If you don't want to miss the next part. This story will be complete in 2 parts. Now let's start the story. The girl gazed nervously at the gates to the hidden village of leaves, her heart racing at the thought of recovering some of her lost memories. The hidden grass village had been very good to her, had taken her in, had nursed her back to life. But she still didn't feel as though she fitted in. They still hadn't worked out what had happened to her. An elderly woman from that village had found her while on a walk in the forest. She had cuts and bruises all over her body and terrible internal bleeding, not to mention all her torn clothes and lack of memory. They only knew her name was Mika because it was tattooed on the back of her neck, covered by her purple top. She took a deep calming breath, tried to tidy her rich puce-colored hair and knocked. Almost immediately a man opened a small side door and gazed at her curiously. She smiled awkwardly at him, noticing the different symbol on his forehead protector. Suddenly she got a flash of a memory in which she was a very small child, jumping up and down, trying to get hold of one of those headbands which an older boy was holding just out of reach. It only lasted a second, but Mika was thrown by the sudden flashback, and it clearly showed. "Are you alright?" asked the man, watching her anxiously. "Are you here on business or leisure?" he asked, trying to work out whether she was dangerous or not. I'm not sure." She mumbled uncertainly, rubbing her forehead beneath her forehead protector. She knew the man only wanted to help her, but she had been thrown completely off guard. The woman standing behind her stepped forwards and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "My name is Miyuki Aneko," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly as it always did, soothing Mika with its familiarity. "I am the girl's guardian since we do not know who her family is. That is indeed our mission," she added, smiling down at the apprehensive girl. "We're harmless." The man smiled kindly and stepped to one side, letting them both through and bidding them both have a nice day. They went through the gates, watched by a couple more guards who nodded politely at them and smiled. "Mika, what happened back there?" asked Miyuki uneasily. "You looked as though you were going to be sick." They walked slowly along the crowded marketplace, slow enough for Miyuki to keep her strength up. She was very old. "I got another flash," admitted the girl, rubbing her left eye. She had had a couple of them before now, but none so vivid. "It was the forehead protector," she added. "The symbol?" asked the ancient woman slowly. Mika nodded. "Then we're in the right village," she continued, smiling reassuringly at the worried girl. "Would you like some ramen?" she asked, noticing what looked like a small ramen restaurant. Mika smiled gratefully at her and followed her to the bar where she sat down. Miyuki ordered and absented herself to the bathroom. Mika looked over at the boy beside her eating his ramen voraciously. He had blonde hair, an orange and black tracksuit, and what looked like whiskers. She also noticed his forehead protector, helping her decide to talk to him. "So what exactly is in ramen?" she asked nervously, trying to sound nonchalant, but failing. The boy mumbled something incoherent with his mouth full, without looking at her. "I guessed it had something to do with noodles, I just wanted to know what." She giggled, a little awkwardly, making him look up reluctantly. He jumped suddenly, and his face turned beetroot red as a huge sheepish grin stretched from one of his ears to the other. Mika grinned back uncomfortably as he scratched the back of his neck, his eyes darting briefly up to her forehead protector and the grass village symbol. "Not from around here, huh?" he asked her, still grinning. "It's complicated," she answered, looking down at the counter where the barman had placed a glass of water. "In fact, would you know where I could get a forehead protector with that sim?" "Never mind that," interrupted the blonde boy, surprising the brown-eyed girl. "The question is, do you have a map?" he said loudly, his rasping voice hovering around them both. Mika raised an inquiring eyebrow, widening her eyes in disbelief. "Because I think I'm lost in your eyes," he finished, blushing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she asked awkwardly, feeling her cheeks burn bright red, and watched as the boys did too. "I don't even know your name." "I'm Naruto Uzumaki," he said quickly, his cheeks slowly fading back to tan. "What's your name?" "Mika, I kinda don't know my second name, that's why it's complicated," she answered, smiling apologetically. "I lost my memory," she explained, seeing his confused face. "At least it wasn't your mind," exclaimed Naruto loudly, laughing in a friendly way, making Mika feel welcome. "I like it here," she thought to herself as she and her new friend continued to giggle. "I feel like I belong, somehow." "So, who's this?" came Miyuki's voice from behind Mika. "We've been here less than 5 minutes, and you've already made a new friend," she continued, smiling kindly at the couple of pre-teens. "This is Naruto Uzumaki, Miyuki-sensei," explained Mika happily, glancing from one to the other. About the headband thing, said the friendly boy. I can ask Kakashi-sensei, if you like. He finished, obviously trying to impress her by his good deed. Thanks, that would be great. Exclaimed Mika happily, excited of getting even more integrated into this community. The little girl sighed mournfully as the rain pattered down at the glass pane. She looked sadly away from the window and made her way back to where she had been sitting on the floor, her drawing unfinished and her best friend busy on his own picture. Why does it have to rain on my birthday? She asked as she picked up a blue crayon. I'm big now, I shouldn't have to be stuck inside anymore. She added, coloring in a bit of her picture. Oh yeah, 4 years old. Sneered an older boy who was polishing his forehead protector. Really big. He added sarcastically. Yama, don't taunt your little sister. Came a deep calming voice from the kitchen as the children's father poked his head around the corner. Yama got up and walked out of the living room, sneering at the girl as he passed her. I bet ninja don't stay inside when it rains. Continued the little girl, gazing down at her picture proudly. The boy beside her stayed silent. He felt uncomfortable because she was in a bad mood. Do you like your name? She asked suddenly, looking at him curiously. My parents chose a name for me and I must honor it. He said after a short pause. The girl rolled her pretty deep hazel eyes exasperatedly. Yes, but would you prefer another name? She asked slowly. A different one. He shook his head, smiling at her. She turned back to her drawing. You had to have white shorts, didn't you? She exclaimed, smiling adoringly at her best friend who giggled back at her. She looked down at her two stick figures, herself and the boy sitting next to her. She was trying to color in the lines, but had come up against his white shorts. The boy reached over with a black crayon and drew the outline of a pair of oversized shorts onto his stick self. That looks okay. He said, admiring his handiwork. The girl smiled up at him, agreeing. She then bent back over the picture and wrote, in very shaky letters, his name followed by from Mika. Mika and Miyuki followed Naruto to where he knew Kakashi was teaching Sasuke and Sakura a new technique which, somehow, he had already perfected. He spent the whole 5-minute walk finding out every detail of her. They thought she was 15 because she was so well developed, and she believed she came from the Hidden Leaf Village because she had uncovered a hidden memory of the leaf symbol. So he thought to himself, she's 2 years older than me, but she seems to like me, plus she's hot. He blushed as he imagined that she could hear his thoughts. Kakashi's just round here. He told the two women who were smiling expectantly at him. When they arrived at the large platform, they saw Sakura concentrating hard in the very center, a small ring of fire around her feet, but it soon dwindled then died away, leaving her panting and disappointed. You're getting better, Sakura. Came Kakashi's voice away to the small audience's left. Slowly. There is no shame in being the last one to perfect a jutsu. The girl huffed unhappily. I must speak with our guests. Kakashi-sensei. Called out Naruto, waving to his teacher who walked slowly over to them. These ladies have come from the Hidden Grass Village because she's lost her memory. He explained, pointing at Mika who blushed crimson, smiling awkwardly. Sir, I am but a humble old woman now and haven't the strength to follow young ninja around anymore. Said Miyuki slowly. Would you mind taking her on? She's no trouble. Now Miyuki, I know that you were not always a humble old woman. Replied the silver-haired man quietly, secret understanding echoing between them softly, making the old woman smile. What sort of level are you? He asked, addressing the small girl. I'm average. She answered politely, fiddling nervously with her purple skirt. Hidden Grass Village average. Pointed out Miyuki, quickly nodding to Kakashi, understanding yet again floating between them. Would she be able to keep up with me? Asked the man still watching the brown-eyed girl curiously. Naturally. Replied the old woman, smiling proudly at the girl with the rich plum-colored hair. She's got a gift for strategies as well. She added, nodding shakily again. Mika grinned sheepishly, her cheeks burning again as she felt 2 pairs of eyes boring into the back of her head. Why does she always have to say that? She asked herself uncomfortably, looking over her shoulder and seeing the pink-haired girl and the blonde boy both watching her curiously. I'm not that good, I came 7th, for goodness sake I'm average. She came 7th. Added Miyuki, as if on cue, making Mika's eyes widen in horror and embarrassment. 7th out of 20, that is. At the Grass Village Academy? Asked Kakashi, raising his eyebrows in surprise. That would be just below our top student's level. Miyuki nodded proudly. What? Mika screamed incredulously in her own head. I've been the second best in this village and they've been constantly telling me I'm average. Okay, well I'm still going to have to ask you one question to see if you're good enough for my squad. Otherwise you'll have to go into a different squad. Understand? Said Kakashi, coming and standing in front of her, towering above her menacingly, but she didn't cower or even flinch. She nodded decisively, but before the masked man could continue there was a sound of choking behind them. Mika. Came Sasuke's voice from the other side of the platform, spitting out a mouthful of whatever he was drinking, his face that of astonished shock and disbelief. Mika gazed at him in surprise. Is that really you? Suddenly he'd thrown the cup out of his hand and run over to her, thrown his arms around her shoulders and was hugging her passionately, as though she was a long-lost friend, bittersweet tears pouring out of his deep blue eyes. I didn't think you I thought that he stuttered, the tears tearing his voice up. I thought he killed where have you suddenly he stopped. Why aren't you happy to see me? He asked quietly, the pain audible in his voice. He let her go and stood back, looking her up and down. It's you, isn't it? I'd recognize you anywhere. I don't know who you are. She said quietly, conscious of his pain and feeling awkward that she didn't remember him while he had had this extreme reaction. The tears were still falling from his eyes, rolling down his red cheeks as his face fell, what looked like his dreams shattered, and it seemed as though he had just been murdered inside. I can't remember, she tried to explain, tried to ease his pain which she didn't understand. I lost. I'm sure it's you. He exclaimed suddenly, desperation coursing through his voice. You're Mika, aren't you? She nodded quickly. And you've got your name tattooed on the back of your neck, right? He asked, pressing for an answer which might ease his obvious agony. How did you? Asked Mika nervously, her hand automatically reaching for the back of her neck where she knew her name was inscribed for eternity in beautiful Japanese script, but he interrupted her. Because you're Mika Tikik. He cried desperately, the tears rolling down his cheeks again as he tried to prove his point, guessing that she couldn't remember. We used to be best friends. Your family and mine. We were always together. How can you not remember? He asked finally, distraught frustration tearing him from the inside out. It's me. He continued, pressing his hands on his chest. It's me. Sasuke. You've got to remember. He finished, grabbing her roughly by the upper arms and shaking her in disappointment. At that moment Kakashi stepped in and pulled Sasuke off of the girl who had by now started crying herself at the sight of Sasuke's anguish. The blue-haired boy fought ferociously to get to the brown-haired girl, but Kakashi, Naruto and Sakura were all holding him back, fighting back their own tears at his agonizing frustration. Mika watched in horror as they pulled the boy named Sasuke away, still fighting viciously to get to her, to try and show her. She turned around and pressed her tearful face into Miyuki's shoulder to try and drown out his desperate calls, his pleas to her. Please Mika. Please remember. He screamed at her, seeing her hide her face in the old woman's shoulder. You've got to remember. Please, you're the only one left. He yelled before Kakashi put a sleep spell on him and forced him to fall into a deep slumber, but his voice still echoed agonizingly in the plum-color-haired girl's head. She hated herself. Why couldn't she remember? When he had finally stopped moving and trying to get to Mika, she looked out from Miyuki's shoulder and followed her over to where the boy was stretched out on the ground, his face finally relaxed, but the marks the tears had made were still etched into his cheeks. She looked down on the poor boy as he breathed deeply, his eye twitching every now and then in his sleep as he dreamt. She looked up at the three people kneeling beside him. Naruto was looking up at her curiously, Kakashi was muttering under his breath with his hand on the boy's forehead, and the girl, Sakura, was gazing down at Sasuke tenderly, tears gushing down her own cheeks. You know Sasuke? Asked Naruto curiously, still watching Mika from his kneeling position beside Sasuke's legs. Mika shook her head slowly, trying not to cry out in pain at what she'd just put the boy through. I can't remember. She whispered, not able to speak properly due to the emotion tearing her throat, begging her to scream out in pain, but she held it back. Suddenly the pink-haired girl glared up at her threateningly. How can you not remember? She asked sarcastically, poison etched in her tone. What, did you get amnesia or something? She asked, just as nastily. He obviously remembers you, why can't you remember him? Calm down Sakura. Said Kakashi calmly as he got up, still looking down at Sasuke's lifeless body. It's not her fault. And we've got to try and accept her as someone no one knows and has never heard of until she can recover her memories. He said quietly looking up at the girl kindly. Why? Asked Sakura menacingly, glowering at the tear-stricken Mika. She just barges in here, expects to be accepted for something she is and put Sasuke through all that, and now we have to accept her. Yes. Replied Kakashi shortly, without even looking at the angry girl. He walked calmly up to Mika and put a hand on her shoulder reassuringly. Don't worry, she's not always like this. He said quietly before continuing in a whisper. She's jealous that Sasuke is so emotional over you while he finds her annoying. She can have that any day. Answered Mika tearfully, looking up into his friendly face. He smiled kindly underneath his mask. I do still have to ask you that question. He said quietly, she nodded. Imagine you are the leader of a squad and you're pursuing a band of renegade ninja in a dense forest. They turn and face you. What do you do? He asked, watching her as she worked it all out in her head. It depends on what my squad is like. she said after a moment, gazing vacantly off into the distance. What level are they? Are they my level? All of them. Kakashi nodded. I'd send the fastest off to position themselves on the opposite side of the band, then the second would position themselves at an angle, thus surrounding them. I would act as a decoy, attacking them full on, taking all their attention, and then the others would attack from behind, catching the renegade ninja off guard. That way I am the one in the most danger, so the others can escape safely if needed and call for reinforcements. She finished, looking up into his face benignly. So teamwork is a big part of your plan? Asked the Jonin. Their safety before yours. He added, closing his eyes and scratching his chin through the mask. Good. That's the same sort of strategy I would have used. Good. Yes, you can stay in my squad. What? Screamed Sakura, outraged. Inner Sakura. What? She gets to stay in our squad, that means she'll be close to Sasuke. How dare she? Sasuke is mine. He was just coming around to it as well. Mika's gonna be in our squad. Awesome. Exclaimed Naruto, punching the air above his head. I'll give you a tour of the village if you like. There's loads of stuff to do, believe it. He finished, beaming up at her. Mika smiled uncertainly at him. Mika yawned deeply. She'd been waiting for him for at least 5 minutes. At the age of 5, she thought that people might take her more seriously, but he was still late. On top of that, he was the one who had told her to meet him here because he had found a great new place. She looked around, bored. She knew this place like the back of her hand. The clearing in the forest outside her house, just before the river where she and her best friend, who happened to be late, often swam in the summer, despite their parents' warnings. Mika. Mika, over here. Came that familiar voice, about 20 feet to the girl's right. Sorry I'm late, brother wanted to tell me something. So he's more important than me? She asked jokingly, running over to him, a huge smile on her happy face, mirrored in his own. What did he want? Is he going to train you then? I wish Yama would train me. Do you think your brother might train me too? He might. Answered the little boy excitedly. I suppose you and him should get to know each other a bit more. There was an awkward pause. They didn't usually bring the subject up, and swiftly changed it if it did occur. Why won't Yama train you? He asked, stifling the painful silence. Because he doesn't like me. Replied the girl sadly, her usually bouncy head drooping a little. I'm a girl and he thinks girls aren't as good at being ninjas as boys. She added grumpily. Well, you'll show him, won't you? Said the boy, trying to perk his best friend up a little, but it didn't work. He took her little hand in his and pulled her gently along behind him. Come on, I have to show you something that I found the other day. He said excitedly, looking over his shoulder at the girl's confused face. They ran through the quiet forest, giggling at nothing in particular, happy to be young, free and best friends. They soon arrived at the edge of what looked like a clearing, except that the ground was covered in large, slimy-looking, mollusk-like things. They were about 5 feet tall, about a foot above their heads, a strange sort of dark red color, and they smelt faintly like a mix of moss and seaweed. The boy gazed up at them proudly, still clutching the girl's hand, as she grimaced up at them in relative disgust. What are they? She asked quietly, nervous they might bite if they knew she was there. They smell weird. She added, wrinkling her nose as she got a whiff of their peculiar fragrance. I don't know what they are. Answered the boy, shrugging but still smiling up at them. But look at how cool they are. He added, letting go of the girl's hand, making her feel insecure, and running up to the first one and throwing himself onto it. He clambered up inelegantly and then sat on it for a moment, gazing down at Mika, bouncing slightly. Aren't they neat? He asked again, his face pulled into an excited expression, waiting for her approval. Answered the brown-eyed girl awkwardly, stepping gingerly closer to the large red thing, feeling mud squelch beneath her toes. Don't stay down there too long, there's loads of mud, and I lost my shoe when I first found this place. Pointed out the dark-eyed boy, holding his hand out for the girl to take, which she did. He pulled her up onto the bouncy thing, tugging her by her shirt. She looked around and saw hundreds more of these strange mollusk-like things, stretched out across the whole clearing. She grasped the boy's hand for support as the thing she was gingerly kneeling on wobbled like a massive piece of jelly, giving her the impression that it wasn't very stable. Are you sure this thing is safe? She asked, taking the boy's other hand as well and inching a little closer for extra support. The boy shrugged unhelpfully. I've only got this far. He said, a small laugh in his voice. We're in the same boat. He added. The girl looked up at him incredulously. What? I was too scared to go any further on my own. I thought you'd like to do it with me. You usually like this sort of thing. He added, tentatively trying to stand up. Mika stood up too, and the two children looked around the plane of red mollusk-like squishiness. Suddenly the boy pushed the small girl forwards, onto the next crimson thing, making her squeal out in terror. The boy giggled at the girl as she picked herself up off of her stomach and glared back at him with an incredulous smile on her pretty face. What'd I do that for? she asked, standing up again as he continued to clutch his stomach and roar with laughter. She jumped back onto his squishy thing and shoved him onto the next one, making him cry out in surprise. Ha! Take that. He got up again with a mischievous look on his face. You're gonna pay for that. He growled in fake fury. The girl squealed and ran off, leaping from mollusk to mollusk at great speed, trying not to fall in the gaps between them. They raced to the opposite end of the clearing and back again, squealing excitedly the whole way before virtually falling down on the first one they had been on, out of breath and sweating crazily. "I've got an idea," said the dark-eyed boy between gasps of breath. The girl looked over at him from her own mollusk, curiously. "Let's have a race," he said excitedly, still gasping for breath. "And I just have a moment here," gasped the girl, lying down on her mollusk, forgetting the slime and the smell. The boy nodded silently and lay down on his own, gazing up at the clear blue sky. He saw out of the corner of his eye a plum-colored shape moving around. He looked over and saw his best friend getting up and rushing off, giggling. He jumped up and ran after her, jumping from mollusk to mollusk, dodging the mini canyons between them where he knew thick mud lay at the bottom. He overtook her just before they got to the end, laughing triumphantly at her as he did so. He got to the end and turned to go the other way, but his foot slipped on the slimy crimson thing and he fell down, letting Mika overtake him again to his infuriation. He leapt up again and continued the pursuit, catching up to her as he did so until he was only a couple of yards behind her. Suddenly she disappeared down one of the mini canyons with a small yelp. He stopped to see if she was alright and even held his hand out for her to take, which she did. The next thing he knew, he was sitting between two mollusks, covered in mud, while Mika was back on top and finishing the race. "That's not fair," he shouted as he heaved himself up, back onto a mollusk. "You cheated," he yelled as he watched her coming back slowly. His muddy hand slipped on the slimy surface and he fell back down into the thick mud. He sat there in silence, despair coursing through him quietly, and felt the tears prick the back of his eyes. "Come on then," came Mika's voice from above him. "Do you want to get out or not?" she asked, a friendly smile audible in her sweet voice. The boy folded his arms defiantly and looked away from her. He felt her hand tickle his head as she tried to pull him out without his help, but it soon stopped and he presumed that she had given up. He felt his eyes water and a small tear leak out and down his cheek as he wondered how he was going to get out. Suddenly he saw a small, muddy foot appear in front of his eyes, dangling from above, then another foot appeared, followed by a muddy skirt of which you could hardly see the rich purple color underneath, quickly followed by his best friend. Mika. She sat down in front of him, smiling sweetly as though trying to say that it was okay for him to cry. She stuck her finger into the sodden earth and pulled it out again before drawing it along her cheek, creating a line of brown where her finger had passed across her clean skin. She smiled at him again, reached over and did the same to him. "Now we're mud brother and sister," she said quietly, her smile unwavering. There was a long pause in which the boy didn't do anything. "You know what else we can do to make the bond stronger?" she asked, trying to win the boy back. He shook his head gently, watching her quietly. The girl shoved her entire hand into the mud, pulled it out again, and then thrust it onto the boy's chest, leaving a muddy handprint in the middle of his t-shirt. The boy looked down at the muddy mark she had left on his chest and then looked back up at her, a minute smile playing across his lips. He stuck his own hand into the ground and pressed it against her flat chest, leaving the same mark on her chest. The girl gently took his muddy hand in hers and got up, pulling him behind her. Together they helped each other out from between the maroon mollusks, the boy pushing Mika out and then Mika tugging the boy out by his t-shirt and shorts. "Let's go home," she said once they were both out, sitting on the slimy jelly-like thing. They both got up and made their way slowly over to the edge of the clearing, homeward bound, hand in hand, not realizing that the dirty hand marks on their chests would stay there forever. Mika followed the white-haired man apprehensively, twiddling her purple top. She knew the pink-haired girl was walking a few paces behind her, glowering at her back, while the blonde boy, Naruto, chatted with her at her. He was telling her about the time he had saved Sasuke's life when he had become a human pincushion due to multiple attacks from a girl, claiming she was a guy, but Naruto claimed he had seen straight through her disguise. "Why is that girl so mean to me?" asked Mika turning to Naruto suddenly. "What did I do?" Naruto sighed exasperately. Sasuke was always in people's minds, even when he was KO, and even when they didn't realize who he was. "Sakura kinda like Sasuke," explained Naruto, looking straight ahead, not catching the girl's deep hazel eyes. "And when he acted like that to you, well, you know, begging for you to remember him, he's never acted that way before to anyone, and I guess Sakura was just jealous." He glanced over his shoulder at a fuming Sakura. "Well, he seems pretty started the girl with the plum-colored hair a little awkwardly. "Intense," she finished, looking over at her new friend apologetically. "And he's very emotional, isn't he?" she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the girl staring daggers at her. He's not usually like that, said Kakashi, looking over his shoulder at them both. He slowed so they could catch up to him and nudged his way in between them. I'm not sure why you brought that on in him. So it's my fault? She asked, looking up at him incredulously. I only just got into this village and some guy throws himself on me, screaming at me to remember him. It's not your fault, reassured the tall man, smiling down at her kindly. He's not like that normally. At all. He added, widening his eyes. Are you sure he'll be okay in the infirmary? Piped up Sakura, stepping forwards in between Kakashi and Mika, elbowing the girl in the ribs discreetly. I should have stayed with him, I just knowed. She added guiltily. The infirmary is full of healers who will look after him much better than you ever could, Sakura. Answered the Jonin exasperatedly. And I doubt he'd appreciate you watching him sleeping. He added, smiling impishly. Sakura looked over at Mika venomously. A little later, when they had gotten a new Hidden Leaf Village forehead protector for Mika, they were heading to find somewhere for the new girl to stay when they heard running footsteps behind them. They looked around curiously and saw a young boy with a blue t-shirt and white shorts running towards them. Mika winced awkwardly, remembering what had happened last time. Sasuke! Cried Sakura, taking a step towards him, but he just ran straight past her and stopped in front of the brown-eyed girl, breathing heavily. Are you better? But he didn't answer her, he just continued gazing at the girl with the plum-colored hair. I'm really sorry about earlier. He said after a moment, his chest still heaving. I don't know. He stuttered awkwardly. I just think that you should remember me. He said quietly, still watching her closely. I'm really sorry. She answered quietly, trying to explain her situation to him. I kinda lost my memory. She said slowly, a little embarrassed. It was sorta stolen. She added, glancing around at the other three around her. I know who by, said Sasuke, swallowing nervously. I know why too. He added, trying to win her back. Because he destroyed my clan too. He finished darkly. Mika's eyes widened in surprise. I'm part of the clan. She asked incredulously, looking at him curiously. How do you know all this? She asked quickly. Which clan? Where are they now? What happened to them? Why aren't they looking after me? She asked desperately. I'll tell you all about it. Promised the dark-haired boy. We can go and have a drink or something. He offered, smiling a friendly smile. In the background, Mika heard Sakura yelping quietly in the background. Thanks, that would be great. She answered a little self-consciously, feeling the weight of 1,000 daggers pressing against her back, and guessed that Sakura was glowering at her. Maybe we could all go, suggested Sakura desperately, glancing hopefully from one to the other. Inner Sakura. No way am I letting her get her dirty little hands on my precious Sasuke. I think it's best if just Sasuke and Mika went, actually, said Kakashi slowly in his enthralling voice. This is a private matter, Sakura. He added as Sasuke and Mika turned and started walking off in the direction of the high street. Just between them. But she whimpered piteously, looking imploringly up at her sensei. My Sasuke. She finished, watching him walking off with the girl with the plum hair and the black and purple outfit. She narrowed her eyes, wishing that looks could kill, but Mika, inner Sakura. Stupid name, just continued to walk beside Sasuke. Sensei, was she in a clan? Asked Naruto, still watching her head off beside the dark-haired boy. Which clan? Do you know her? Kakashi sighed and closed his eyes as though he was worn out. She was part of the Tika clan. He said on the outbreath, opening his eyes again wearily to watch her as the couple turned a corner and disappeared from sight. A small clan who kept themselves to themselves, but they were very powerful. Almost as powerful as the Uchiha clan, because they didn't have to use hand movements to use attacks. Each member of the clan had the ability to control one element from each of the countries and villages. But she can't remember that, said Naruto, concentrating on what Kakashi had just explained. So, can she still control her element? Which element is it? He asked in quick succession, curious to find out more about this clan and the girl. I think that because she doesn't know she has the power, started the Jonin slowly, frowning to himself. She can't control the element. Because that would cause quite a few problems. He added, nodding to himself. Which is her element? Persisted Naruto unremittingly, his hands balled into fists with anticipation. Do you know? Huh? Do you? Kakashi chuckled paternally at the enthusiastic young boy. Yes, I do know. He answered after a moment. She has control over the waterfall element. He said quietly, smiling down at Naruto. How do you know all this? Asked Sakura quietly, a little suspicious of her teacher. And why are you so sad? I saw your face, your expression changed when you told us about her clan. She said, narrowing her eyes up at him. I know all this because I met Mika's family a few times. He explained, his face falling subtly. I was very close to someone whose family was very close to the Tika clan. I met Mika several times. He finished quietly, looking down at the ground and away from the two young people watching him closely. But, you said the clan kept themselves to themselves. Pointed out Sakura, working it out in her head. Except they were close to the Uchiha clan, you were close to someone in the Uchiha clan. She exclaimed, proud that she had worked it out. I don't want to talk about it, said Kakashi, turning away and starting to walk off in the other direction. Sakura and Naruto called after him, but he just looked over his shoulder and said decisively, I don't want to talk about it, before walking off. Way to go, Sakura, exclaimed Naruto, annoyed, crossing his arms moodily. Now we can't ask him more questions. You're only interested in her because she's got big, shouted the pink-haired girl before stopping herself and blushing. Because she's 15. She finished, rubbing the back of her neck awkwardly. I hadn't even noticed, pointed out Naruto haughtily, making Sakura fume again, knowing perfectly well that he had. The boy beamed cheerfully as he saw the girl running towards him, grasping her lunch bag in one hand and a forehead protector in the other. He watched as she got closer and closer, glancing nervously over her shoulder as she did so. Come on, we've got to go quick, she cried as she got close enough for him to hear her, before racing past him. Come on. Yama will notice it's gone in a minute. Did you steal that from your brother? Asked the boy as he ran along beside her, still smiling as adrenaline pumped through his small body. The girl didn't answer, so he took that as a yes. Soon enough they heard a yell from away through the woods, which the boy in the white shorts had to go through to get to his best friend's house. Over here, gasped Mika, terror and adrenaline gushing through her voice as she ducked down behind a large pillar, big enough to hide both 5-year-olds. Do you want to try it on first, or shall I? She asked, holding the band of fabric out enthusiastically. I'll try it first, said the boy, taking it from the girl's open hand. He wrapped it gently around his forehead, holding it in place with his hands at the back. How do I look? He asked, looking at Mika expectantly. Like a real ninja, she answered excitedly. You look just like your brother, she added, knowing that would please him, and as expected, he grinned back at her ecstatically. My turn, she said, holding her hands out to him. He placed the forehead protector in her twitching hands and watched as she wrapped it around her forehead, watched as it knocked her small nose a couple of times, making him giggle before she looked up at him expectantly. You look so grown up, he exclaimed happily, clapping his hand excitedly, just like you said with me. You look like a real ninja, he added, and got the same response as she had moments before. What are you doing? Came a familiar voice from behind the pillar. The two children looked up nervously and recognized the young boy's older brother. Whose is that? He asked quietly, his face neutral. It's my brother's, answered Mika quietly. She was quite scared of her best friend's big brother, even though he had never done anything to her to make her so. She knew what she had to do, and it made her awkward around him. Besides, he was so powerful that you couldn't help feeling dwarfed around him. I stole it. I'm sorry, she finished, letting it fall off of her forehead and into her lap, where she picked it up and held it up for him to take. Don't apologize to me, said the older boy, smiling down at them calmly. You should return that to Yama, he said, looking over his shoulder as he leaned on the pillar. And then you'd better hurry, or you'll be late for the academy. Yes sir, answered Mika submissively, getting up and nodding her head to the boy. Yes brother, answered the younger brother, smiling at his older sibling, before running off in the direction of the girl's house, followed by the girl herself. The older boy stood for a moment, watching his little brother run off, followed by the girl. She was quite pretty, her plum-colored hair fluttering in the wind, her short purple skirt fluttering behind her, her small gloved hands clutching the forehead protector, as though it was a sacred object. He sighed at the thought of what was to come. He resented his family for choosing his future for him. After a minute or so, the couple of children came running out of the woods again, giggling at some mischief they'd got up to in the few moments they'd been out of his sight. He smiled at their innocence as they ran past him, smiling back at him benignly. His brother and his future wife, running off together to the ninja academy to learn how to become ninjas themselves. His brother and his future wife. He smiled at how wrong that could sound before walking back into the house. Sasuke set the drinks down on the table and then sat down opposite Mika in the bar. She smiled over at him, obviously still nervous from their last encounter, but still polite just as he remembered her. He restrained himself from shouting at her in frustration for not remembering. They had done everything together, and yet she didn't remember. Well, he started awkwardly, unable to look her in the eyes. Why don't you start by telling me what you do remember? He said, looking up into her perplexed face, a small puzzled smile playing across her lips. Well, she started, her eyes darting here and there nervously. I remember waking up in a hospital and an old woman, Miyuki, explaining to me that she had found me in the forest all battered and bleeding. She said, smiling nervously over at him. No one can work out what happened to me. She added, shrugging, as though that was it and she had given up. I know what happened. said Sasuke darkly, leaning in a little closer over the table. Well, not to you exactly, but I know what happened to your family, to your clan. He added, watching her face become more and more enthralled. My brother. That's what happened, and I'm training to restore my clan and kill him. He finished darkly, sitting back in his chair and crossing his arms decisively. Mika raised her eyebrows. Wouldn't that be a little bit hypocritical? She asked, shaking her head slightly, making her long hair flutter. It was longer than when he had last seen her, but exactly the same color, and her eyes, still the rich deep shade of hazel that had always mesmerized him. I'm sorry? He asked, completely thrown by this simple response to his meaningful words of revenge. Hypocritical? He finished, hardly believing his ears. Well, yes. She answered, shrugging apologetically. He killed your clan and family, and so you want to sink to his level and kill him. She explained simply, as though it was the easiest thing to grasp. Mika, he betrayed us all. Explained Sasuke, refusing to believe what she was saying. Not just my family, nor my clan, but your family and clan too. We were the two strongest clans out of all the others. Okay, well, why don't you start by explaining to me the situation with my clan and yours? Interrupted the brown-eyed girl, feeling uncomfortable that she didn't even know her circumstances. 'Cause I'm a bit stumped, if you know what I mean. She finished laughing at herself. Your clan was called the Tika clan. He explained, leaning his elbows on the table and sitting forwards. You all lived in a little hamlet on the other side of the woods, not far from where I used to live. There was your family, your uncle's family, which was just his wife, and your grandparents. Each one of you had control over a certain element from a certain country, like fire or earth or waterfall. He added, looking up at her, searching for a reaction, but none came, so he just continued. The thing that made you so powerful was the fact that you didn't need to use hand motions to use your powers, and so no one could really stop you, but your clan was peaceful and only wanted a quiet life. That's why they didn't live in the village, but in the woods. He looked up again and noticed tears brimming in her eyes. I'm sorry. She said quietly, closing her stunning brown eyes and looking away. Sasuke moved his chair around so he was sitting next to her instead of opposite, and put his hand on her arm, which was sitting peacefully in her lap. It's just you say you did this, and you did that, she said slowly, still not looking at him, but her arm hadn't pulled away. I don't remember all that. She added, looking him straight in the eyes. They sat there for a moment in silence. Sasuke began to hope that she was remembering something, but she looked away uncomfortably. You keep telling me things, and I want to believe them, but she stopped for a moment, turning to face him again and taking his hand. I don't have powers. I can't control fire or earth or anything. Sasuke looked down at the pair of hands clutching each other sadly, looking at every detail of hers. The hands which he hadn't held in over 3 years, but which still gave him goosebumps when it touched his. She doesn't remember a thing. He thought miserably. He looked back up at her face, noticing the tears running slowly down her flushed cheeks, and smiled kindly. I want to show you something. He said quietly, getting up but not letting go of her precious hand. She followed nervously, her eyes never leaving his, the trust in them making Sasuke feel very protective. I have got to make her remember, no matter what. He led her along the roads, through the center of the village, right to the far end where the houses became bigger and more expensive, but they went past all the expensive houses and found what looked like an empty one. He led her in, taking his shoes off at the step in the doorway, as he had been taught to by his parents. They went along the empty corridors, dust flying around their feet as they made their way slowly through another doorway, onto what seemed to be a sort of veranda-like walkway with a wooden wall on their left. He stopped in front of a pair of big wooden doors, the tears stinging his eyes as he remembered the last time he was here. Mika stepped a little closer to him for reassurance, realizing this must have been his family home. She looked up at him as he continued to gaze at the large doors, his eyes wet as he fought the tears back. Don't stay here. She whispered, snaking her arm through his and trying to gently prise him away from the wooden doors, but he shook his head. No, I want you to see this. He said, his voice shaky but resolute. With his free arm he pushed the doors open and stepped inside, pulling Mika along with him. There they were. The markings the detectives had left behind when they had found Fugaka and Makoto Uchiha lying here, dead. The chalk outlines a little faded and hidden by the dust which covered the floor, but the image was still clear in Sasuke's mind. His parents lying there, one on top of the other, and Itachi, his own brother, standing over them like a hunter, proudly observing his kill. Mika stepped forwards to look upon the memory of the horror which Sasuke had witnessed firsthand over 3 years ago. Those were my parents, said the boy, his voice strained against the tears and emotions tearing at his throat and heart. Mika turned and looked into his face, her own eyes brimmed with tears. She didn't say anything, but he knew she was apologizing, even though she didn't know what for. She took his hand again, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end again, and stood right in front of him just gazing up at him, the tears falling down her cheeks by now, and silently let him know that he was safe with her, that he could let it all out, all the emotions he'd hidden away for all those years he could let them out. He was only human. Sasuke hung his head as the tears rolled down his cheeks, trying not to show the pain which had torn his life apart from that night on. He let himself fall to his knees on the dusty floor, watching the filth flutter around his legs and Mika's feet. He shut his eyes against a memory, hoping that it might go away. The sound of their voices was still clear in his mind, the memory of Itachi's face as he stood over them. He felt Mika lower herself to her knees in front of him and pull him into her arms, wrapping them around him and pulling him onto her shoulder, as his own shoulders trembled, while the tears gushed silently down his cheeks and onto the floor. Mika elegantly moved her knees below his head so he could lean on her properly and stroked his hair, reminding him of the time he had fallen and grazed his knee training. "We should go," she whispered in his ear as he started to calm down. "This is no place to defile," she continued as he sat up, letting her arms slide gracefully off of his shoulders and back into her lap. She smiled soothingly at him, wishing she could do more. Sasuke wiped his face and stood up, looking over at the marks on the floor one more time before following Mika out again, closing the door respectfully and saying farewell to his parents again. At the academy, Mika and her best friend were practicing shuriken target. They each had 3 shuriken, and they had to throw them from 20 feet away and try and hit the bullseye. So far the young boy had hit just outside the bullseye twice and the ring outside that one once, whereas Mika had missed once and the other 2 were in the second ring to last. She glared at the boy beside her. "You should aim a little higher than the bullseye," he advised, noticing her glowering as she ripped the little pieces of metal out of the wood. "And it looks cool to make them spin." "I can't make them spin," she shouted, frustrated as she ripped the last one out and stomped back to the 20 feet mark, fuming. She tried again and still only got the last ring. "Why are you so much better than me?" she asked angrily. "This just proves brother's point," she added. "No it doesn't," contradicted the boy, rubbing his neck awkwardly, hoping she hadn't noticed his perfect bullseye. "Look, you're much better than that blonde boy over there." He pointed out the boy in question who was throwing them all over the place, nowhere near the target. He was working on a target with empty ones on either side of him, while all the other target stumps around Mika and her best friend were occupied. "Why is he all alone?" she asked, watching him throw another shuriken which hit the ground just in front of Iruka-sensei. "Why aren't the stumps on both sides of him taken?" "Because he's weird," answered the boy standing next to Mika, as though it was obvious. "And I don't think anyone wants to be skewered by shuriken," he added as one of the boy's little metal stars landed about a meter from them, making them both jump backwards. Mika's friend glared as the blonde boy came running over to reclaim his shuriken. "Sorry," he apologized, bending over and picking up the piece of metal. "I guess I should practice more, huh?" he added, scratching the back of his neck. Mika smiled at him, finding him funny. "I'm not very good either," she pointed out, shrugging and smiling at him. "And I practice all the time," she added, hoping to make him feel more at ease, and he laughed along with her. After a sufficient amount of time, Mika asked the question burning on her lips. Why are you all alone?" "I don't know," he admitted, shrugging and looking to his left. "But I guess it's best while I'm practicing my shuriken aim," he added, laughing at his atrocious shot. The boy next to Mika continued to frown at him. I guess I'd better go and train," he said, making his way back over to his stump. "He's not weird," said Mika to the boy next to her when the blonde boy was at a safe distance. "He's funny," she added, still smiling after him. "I don't like him," declared Mika's friend as he turned to frown at her, showing his disapproval. "You don't like anyone?" answered Mika, smiling up at him indulgently. He frowned down at her, still not convinced. "I'm surprised you like me," she added, grinning mischievously. He smiled back down at her. Sasuke and Mika wandered around the village, chatting about what it was like when they were all happy, what it was like before. After a while, the young girl looked over at the young boy curiously. "He really messed you up, huh?" she said quietly, a soft expression on her pretty face. "Your brother, I mean," she added, worried he thought she was talking about his father. "I mean earlier when you said that you wanted to kill him, I kinda thought that was a little hypocritical, but I get it now. He messed with your head," she decided, looking straight ahead as Sasuke snapped his head around to look at her in disbelief, but after a moment of thinking he looked away again with a small frown of concentration on his forehead. "I guess he did," he answered quietly after a while. She turned to smile at him kindly. He looked at her silently as they continued to meander casually around the village. "Not that there's anything wrong with wanting to avenge your family," she added, gazing around at the different houses with various people standing around chatting or walking to assorted rendezvous they might have. "That's very honorable of you," she finished, smiling at him again. Without thinking, he smiled back at her the same as he always did before. He looked away, feeling the nostalgia of happy memories lost in time. She noticed his sad face and looked away awkwardly, wondering whether it was something to do with her. "Hey, wanna have some fun?" she asked suddenly, bouncing out in front of him and tapping her knuckles together hopefully. Sasuke gazed at her for a moment, his face blank but curiosity in his dark eyes. "Come on." She coaxed tantalizingly, a look of naughty excitement on her even features. "When was the last time you had some fun?" she asked, leaning on one foot and crossing her arms, raising an inquiring eyebrow. "What are you going to do?" asked Sakura suddenly appearing just behind Sasuke, making him and Mika jump in surprise. She also had her arms crossed but, contrary to Mika, she had a disapproving frown on her pretty face. "Not troublemaking I hope," she added, glaring at Mika accusingly. "Sakura," growled Sasuke menacingly, glowering at the pink-haired girl. "We're trying to have a private conversation." He snarled, awkward that she may have been listening to their conversation. "That's not what she thinks," pointed out Sakura, simpering at the boy before glaring at Mika again. "She's hoping there's something more between you two," she added slyly, narrowing her eyes deviously. Mika glared at her incredulously, but Sakura wasn't interested. Faster than anyone could have seen, Sasuke had grabbed the stunned girl in a half Nelson and had a small blade pressing against the back of her neck ominously, pushing the skin menacingly, but not quite breaking through. "Take that back," he threatened forebodingly, gritting his teeth as he did so. Sakura whimpered piteously, trying to look over her shoulder at the boy she so longed for. Sasuke started Mika, watching them both nervously, wondering whether he was always this radical. "Let her go, Sasuke," she finished quietly, holding her hands out soothingly. The young boy released Sakura, letting her drop to her knees, massaging her sore wrists. "I thought she had insulted you," he mumbled, watching Mika steadily, worried that he had scared her again. "I'm sorry I'm not usually like this," he finished, looking awkwardly down at the ground. "She didn't insult me," answered Mika quietly, her eyes darting nervously between the boy and the ground. "I thought she was insulting you," she continued, feeling her cheeks burn. "But you're 2 years younger than me," she started apologetically, but Sasuke looked up hopefully. "No you're not," he rectified quickly, hope glittering in his dark eyes. "You're the same age as me. Your birthday is a month after mine," he added, nodding enthusiastically. Sakura whimpered on the ground in front of him. "So started Mika again, twiddling her skirt again uncomfortably. "Do you wanna have some fun?" she asked, her cheeks shining bright red. Sasuke's eyes widened in surprise. "No," exclaimed the girl quickly waving her hands crazily at him. "No, I meant well I don't know. Do stuff," she finished, shrugging her shoulders. "Awkwardly." Sasuke whimpered Sakura from where she was kneeling on the ground, clutching her stomach as silent tears inched down her cheeks. "Inner Sakura. Please don't do this to me, I love you, Sasuke." The dark-eyed boy looked down at her silently, then looked back up at Mika, who was also looking down at Sakura uncomfortably. Sasuke walked over to Mika and jerked his head in the direction of the park, indicating that she should follow him, but she didn't. She stepped forwards, towards the pink-haired girl who was still trembling on the ground, and held out her gloved hand for Sakura to take. The green-eyed girl looked up at Mika in surprise, her eyes still wet from the tears which had leaked from them, but took her hand and got to her feet shakily. Mika smiled at her kindly, then turned and ran off to Sasuke, who had been watching them quietly, his hands in his pockets. "Mika tick," said Sakura quietly, watching them walk away slowly, chatting. "I will defeat you," she continued in a whisper. "I will destroy you," she finished, her eyes narrow as she glared menacingly at the oblivious couple. Mika panted as silently as she could, hiding behind an empty barrel somewhere in the village. She could smell the sweet, distinctive smell of apples, and guessed that the contents of the empty barrel must have been apples. She tried to peer out, but found that she couldn't do so without being seen herself, and she couldn't let that happen, she couldn't be found. People were walking slowly by, not paying any attention to the small girl hiding behind the empty barrel, worrying about their own boring problems like money, or something dumb like that. Suddenly she heard his voice, he was asking someone if they'd seen her. Mika froze in terror. He was going to fins her, and when he did he knew what he might do to her. She knew that he would find her in her current hiding place, so she discreetly crawled out and behind a large lady with a shopping bag in her hand. Mika grinned up at the unknown lady, hoping she wouldn't mind her hiding behind her. The woman sighed exasperatedly and started walking again, ignoring Mika who was walking along in her wake, trying to make sure she was completely hidden from the boy she was hiding from. "I can see you," she heard him cry just when she was thinking that the coast was clear. She squealed in surprise and dashed out from behind the woman and ran off down the street, painfully aware that he was faster than her and was catching up fast. She dodged the other people in the street, elegantly twisting her body to narrowly miss a man clutching a whole load of chickens in his arms. She heard the chickens clucking desperately and the man cursing as she knew her friend had crashed into him, apologizing profusely as he ran off after her. Haha. You will never catch me. She cried over her shoulder as she ran through the thick crowd, not caring that people were complaining bitterly. Mwahaha. She laughed in fake maniacal laughter as she shoved another kid she knew from Ninja Academy out of the way. She turned off into a dark side alley which was a shortcut towards her house, and therefore, the woods. She dashed around corners, jumped over dustbins and stray cats, and scrabbling over low rooftops, leading her closer and closer to her goal. The woods. She jumped over the low wall dividing his house from the field which belonged to her family, and landed in the long grass which came up to her waist. She started to fight against the thick grass, but it got tangled up in her feet and made her trip up, forcing her to pick herself up again and try again, but she didn't get very far before she fell over again. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the dark-haired boy catching up quickly, but obviously finding it just as difficult as she was. She tried again. The grass getting longer and longer until it was above her head, her feet getting caught in the thick of it at the base, bringing her to her knees before she pulled herself desperately up again. Suddenly she felt a pair of arms around her waist, pulling her to the ground with the owner of them. She turned to look at him, his sweaty forehead and his smiling face, proud that he was able to catch up with her and bring her down. Both children's chests were heaving as they panted, exhausted from the chase. Mika laughed for no apparent reason, and the boy joined her. He lay back down in the thick grass, flattening a patch and putting his head on his hands, gazing up at the cloudless sky. Mika curled over to sit beside him and then lay down next to him, their heads not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth they were both emitting, and despite the heat, appreciating the proximity. Mika started the boy, not looking at her. She rolled onto her front and gazed at him quietly, silently letting him know that she was listening. "Will we be together forever?" he asked quietly, still not looking at her, but she knew what he meant. "I mean, even when we're old and stuff, will we still be friends?" he asked, finally looking at her inquiringly. "Of course we will." She answered immediately, as though it was the most obvious thing in the universe, and it was. "Even when we're both married and we have kids and everything." She continued smiling at the idea of him having babies. "But what about before that?" he asked, rolling onto his own stomach and leaning up on his elbows to watch her intently. "When we're both ninjas, you know, and we have to go on missions and stuff," he added, shrugging awkwardly with one shoulder. "Well," started Mika slowly, working out a solution. "We'll be on the same team," she said shortly, "you know, like Obito and Rin and what was his name, again." The boy shrugged, "The guy with the white hair," she said, frowning to herself. "Doesn't Amiko know him?" she asked. "So we'll be on the same squad?" asked the boy insecurely. "Promise?" he persisted, making Mika smile. "Cross my heart and hope to die," she said, sitting up slightly and crossing her heart with her finger awkwardly. Mika smiled maliciously over at Sasuke, who was holding a limp balloon in his left hand, watching her as though intrigued by what she was doing. Her hands moved swiftly and gracefully through the knots and the fiddly rubber heads, making perfectly sure the water couldn't escape, then placing the fragile sphere on the grass beside the other 5. She held out her hand and Sasuke passed her the last empty balloon. She hadn't said a word since they had walked away from Sakura, and he hadn't pushed her to do so. He was content just being with her again. She held the last balloon's nozzle under the tap and let the water trickle benignly in, making it expand deliciously onto her free hand, which was cupped beneath it for support. "Who are you going to throw those onto?" he asked finally, speaking the burning question which had been festering in the back of his throat since she had started. 7 water balloons don't do much damage on a whole village," he added, shrugging half-heartedly. She smiled to herself again as the balloon grew even bigger. It was the biggest yet, and she was clearly relishing the sense of mischievous power it gave off. "Oh, it's not for the village," she murmured wickedly, before unplugging the rubber nozzle from the tap and tying a tight knot in it. She placed it carefully with the others and sat back on her feet, looking up at him with an impishly evil look on her pretty face. "Have you ever wondered what your sensei looks like without a mask?" she asked roguishly, raising an eyebrow as she did so. Sasuke smiled maliciously. He knew what she was thinking. He also knew that she would fail miserably to get a look at his face, just as King 7 had done, but he didn't say anything. Let's see what lengths she will go to just to get a glimpse of Kakashi's face beneath the mask. He thought to himself, relishing the idea of either seeing his face and being able to boast to the others, or have a bit of fun in the process. "Naruto reckons he's got fat lips," he told her, watching as her eyes widened at the thought. "Sakura thinks he's got buck teeth," he added, watching the effect it had on the girl and chuckling to himself at her expression. "Maybe he has kissy lips," she whispered, her deep hazel eyes still wide at the many mental images she had in her dirty little mind at that moment. "Anyway, we'll know by this evening," she stated confidently. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, raising his own eyebrow down at her as she smiled maliciously back up at him. Kakashi walked along slowly, reading Icha Icha Paradise as usual. He had just gotten to a really good part when he heard a faint trickling behind him. He turned around with a vaguely curious look on what we can see of his face and scrutinized the empty street behind him. He saw a small ginger cat playing with an anti-stress ball and turned around with a smile. "He'll get what's coming to him," he muttered quietly. Still smiling to himself before he heard a soft popping noise and the ginger cat dashed past him, leaving behind it a trail of damp footprints and drips. Kakashi laughed to himself as his eyes began to water at the memory of the cat scuttling past him at top speed, thinking no more about the bridge he was about to walk under. He wiped his eye delicately as he walking under the shadow of the concrete overpass, going over the scene again in his mind. As he came out the other side he found himself completely soaked from head to toe and suddenly realized how the cat must have felt. "I feel for you, cat," he said under his breath as he held out his book, hoping he hadn't gotten it wet. He shook his arms heavily, trying to force a bit of the water to seep out quicker, and looked up. He could hear giggling and sniggering from on top of the bridge he hadn't paid any attention to. "I wonder," he started, glaring up at the concrete structure above him. He leapt up, you know the way they do in the TV show. And landed on the road above him, staring at Mika and Sasuke who were sniggering uncontrollably at his misfortune, which he didn't doubt they had brought on. When they noticed he was there, they both jumped up and pressed their backs against the wall behind them, which was there to prevent people falling off, and stared at him silently with nervous expressions. "He did it," cried Mika, pointing at Sasuke with a huge grin on her face, making the boy in question jump out of his skin and glance from her to Kakashi nervously. She gave him one last encouraging smile before she too leapt off and disappeared, as they do, leaving the two males staring at each other for a moment before Sasuke followed. Kakashi sighed to himself in exasperation. "What have I let myself in for?" he asked himself, looking off in the direction they had both left hastily in. "Sasuke has never been like this with the others," he added. His face fell as he remembered the last time he had watched Sasuke troublemaking with his young accomplice. They were inseparable, he said to himself, remembering sadly. The white-haired man shuffled benignly along the crowded street, borne down by a large brown bag of what looked like regular groceries. He glanced over to his left as he meandered past a bookstore to see if they had the new installment of Icha Icha Paradise which he so craved, but the new one still hadn't come out, so he walked on by. He sniffed softly. That water balloon had given him the sniffles, making him glare to himself. He had to hand it to them, they were sneaky, but they had obviously found something better to do because he hadn't seen them for several hours. He glanced down into his bag of bought things and made sure he had everything, and indeed something was missing. "Damn it," he muttered, looking over his shoulder and seeing the culprit. "A packet of noodles. You had to go and fall off, didn't you?" he muttered menacingly under his breath. He walked back over to where it was lying on the ground and lowered himself slowly down, not wanting to have to put his groceries down. Suddenly he looked up and there was another water balloon heading straight for him at breakneck speed. Without thinking he used the replacement jutsu, but forgot about his groceries, leaving them to get soaked by the balloon. He looked around frantically, trying desperately to find the culprit, but there was no telltale sniggering or giggling, making Kakashi very nervous. Suddenly there was another one, coming at him from behind. He dodged, but yet another was aimed at him in that position. They were coming thick and fast, and sooner or later he knew he was going to get. Splash. Kakashi peeled the broken piece of rubber off of his face moodily, glaring at Sasuke and Mika who were rolling around on the floor, gasping for breath as they laughed so hard they clutched at their stomachs. "Very clever," he said sarcastically, making his way over to the two preteens who were still rolling around on the ground. "I think you owe me an Apollo," but before he could finish they had both disappeared in two small puffs of smoke. He growled to himself as he picked up his soaking groceries and continued walking, noticing the ginger cat from earlier watching him smugly. Sasuke grinned as he watched Mika showing him how to make flour bomb. She carefully poured the white substance into the colorful balloon, concentrating hard so as not to lose too much flour. He hadn't smiled this much in so long, he couldn't even remember. He looked around a little uncertainly, hoping no one was watching. "Hey Sasuke. Mika," came Naruto's voice behind him. He turned around sharply, his usual scowl in place as his friend walked quickly over. "What you two up to?" he asked, noticing Mika's flour-covered face. She had jumped when he had called out to them. "That could be disturbing," added the blonde boy under his breath, his eyes widening at Mika, who was just wiping the white powder off her lips with the back of her gloved hand. "We're trying to see what's under Kakashi-sensei's mask," said Mika, answering his question before Sasuke could say anything about Naruto's remark. "You want in?" she asked, smiling up at him. "With flower bombs?" he asked skeptically, raising an unconvinced eyebrow. Mika nodded enthusiastically. You haven't really thought this through, have you? We already tried getting him to show us his face. He added, scratching his upper left arm. Well, that's news to me. Muttered Mika moodily, looking back down at her newly made bomb miserably. She sighed unhappily as her bright idea came crashing down around her before quickly coming back to herself. Either way it's fun, right? She said, looking back up at Naruto and Sasuke, who was glaring at his teammate menacingly, expectantly. Sure. I'm in then. Answered Naruto, kneeling down beside her and pulling an empty balloon towards him before proceeding to pour copious amounts of flour into it. Sasuke watched as Mika gazed at the blonde boy quietly, a small smile defining her perfect lips, which were a faint shade of red, her lovely deep hazel eyes which he knew he could have got lost in within seconds, her smooth cheeks which he remembered so clearly. He felt a surge of jealousy as Mika took Naruto's hand and showed him how to pour the white substance into the balloon without spilling it. Naruto already had flour all down his front and they giggled together as even more got spilt on his knees. Sasuke, you wanna help? Asked Mika, who was smiling up at him, obviously having noticed his moody face. Hello? Earth to Sasuke. She laughed a little, a friendly laugh which quietly let him know that he wasn't being laughed at, that it was friendly. She handed him a blue balloon and a half-empty packet of flour as he let himself sink to his knees opposite her and Naruto, taking the balloon and the flour and getting to work. Kakashi sat in the bar in a new and dry outfit, moodily wondering whether that was it for the day. It was 6 o'clock after all. He prodded his drink with a toothpick, wondering vaguely why he had bought it since he had all the liquid he needed for today. Damn kids. He thought darkly, closing his eyes in frustration. What do they want from me? I'm sure it's that Mika, she's a bad influence. He paid for his untouched drink and left silently. He walked down the crowded marketplace, deep in thought, not noticing Naruto walking past him and waving in a friendly way. Why are they taking it out on me? What did I ever do to them? Why do they keep getting me? Am I getting slow? As soon as that thought had gone through his mind, he was hit in the back of the head by something, not water, something harder, yet it fell apart on contact with the back of his head. He whipped around and there were Mika, Sasuke and Naruto, all throwing balloons up in the air and catching them as they fell, with one hand and malicious looks on their juvenile faces. He frowned at them, hoping to scare them into giving up and going home, but they stood their ground and before he knew it, Naruto had thrown a second balloon which Kakashi split with a shuriken as it went past him, releasing the white powder all over his face. Damn it. He screamed at himself internally, rubbing the flour out of his furious eyes. The Jonin looked around for them frantically, but they had disappeared. Shit, he glanced around him, trying to ignore the strange looks from the bypassers, but he still couldn't see them anywhere. They're around here somewhere. They won't have run off with at least 2 unused flour bombs. He thought to himself, still searching for them. Out of nowhere 3 flour bombs were heading towards him at breakneck speed, making him duck and leap out of the way, only to land a few yards away and find a bomb exploding just inches away from his feet. He sprang to the side, hoping to lose them with speed, but the bomb kept on exploding too close for comfort. One hit him on the inner right thigh as he tried to dodge it, making him laugh out loud at their good aim, but it was a mistake. Another bomb hit him squarely in the back as he looked around, trying to see the guilty parties. He fell forwards to his knees and laughed to himself, proud that his students were such good shots, and before he knew it, they were all standing in front of him, arms crossed and huge proud yet sheepish grins on their flour-covered faces. That was pretty close. He thought to himself, inspecting the flour on his inner thigh, painfully close to his crotch. That could have really hurt. "Are you given yet?" asked Mika, panting slightly, but a proud look on her dirty face. Kakashi laughed incredulously as he sat back on his feet, looking up at them. "Given to what?" he asked, a laugh in his voice as he tried to rub the flour off of the inside of his trouser leg. "Who threw this one?" he asked, pointing at his inner thigh. He noticed the girl blush slightly and twitch her head a little. "You were aiming pretty naughtily, weren't you?" "We couldn't see exactly where our different bombs went," Naruto said, shrugging, the large grin on his face becoming even larger. "There were so many," he added, closing his eyes proudly. Kakashi looked around and noticed just how much mess they had made in the meantime. The whole street, including several old biddies, were covered in flour and all glaring over at them. "We will clean all this up," he told them, standing up and towering over them menacingly. But they still glared at him. "That wasn't a suggestion," he added, seeing their rebellious faces. "He did it," cried Sasuke and Mika in unison, both pointing at Naruto, who stood there with a look of horror on his face before them both disappeared, Mika leaving an encouraging smile and a flirty wink. The 2 young friends ran as fast as their nearly 7-year-old legs could carry them, through the woods, across the soft ground, heading towards what seemed like a promised land to their young minds. The dark-eyed boy pulled the brown-eyed girl behind him, knowing that she wasn't as fast as he was, but he didn't mind helping her keep up. "Hurry up, slow coach," He cried as they approached their targeted destination. He knew that she was too out of breath to answer, but he didn't mind because he knew what she would have said. Nearly there now, piggy. Shut up. She whispered on a panting out breath. The boy laughed at her touchy voice as he tugged at her hand, feeling the glove give way slightly, but just holding on tighter and feeling her hand squeeze his slightly. They slowed at the sight of the maroon-colored slime ball things, and the boy let Mika catch her breath. She had never much liked running. It had been nearly 10 months since they had been here last, but they had always told themselves that they'd come back. It was just too good a thing to ignore, despite what had happened last time. The young boy had been yearning to come back here since a couple of days after the incident in question, but they had never got round to it, instead finding that they had full schedules to keep up, mostly running around wreaking havoc all over the village, every now and then, finding that it had already been wreaked by some unknown and unimportant troublemaker. I'm not a piggy. She said defiantly when her small chest had stopped heaving uncontrollably, her pretty face damp with sweat, but a mischievous smile defining her lips. You know I don't like that name. She added, standing up straight and rubbing her nose on the back of her hand. That's the only reason I use it. Answered the boy deviously, smiling down at her maliciously. She gave a sort of laugh on the outbreath, still smiling up at him with his own look mirrored on her face. You said yourself that you don't like your name. Did I? She asked, her smile disappearing and being replaced by a look of surprised curiosity. That must have been forever ago, because I really don't remember that. She continued, her smile sneaking its way back onto her even features. Did you happen to mention whether you like yours? She asked, taking on a posh voice and a sneaky-looking expression behind the endearing smile. The boy shook his head without a word, of grin encroaching on his face. Well, do you? Asked the girl with the plum-colored hair curiously. I guess it's better than Itachi. He said after a moment of thought, wincing with the effort of thought and making the girl giggle. But I wouldn't have chosen it for myself. He finished, shrugging uninterestedly, starting to head slowly towards the mollusk-like things which promised such fun ahead of them. Well, shall we make up nicknames for each other? Asked Mika enthusiastically, walking beside him and watching him hopefully. I can call you Blue, and you can call me She looked away, frowning deep in thought. Purple? He suggested, looking over at her quietly. Plum? He continued, shrugging vaguely. Are you crazy? She asked, whipping around to stare at him incredulously. Those are both dumb names. Blue is so much cooler. Sorry, that's all I got right now. He answered, smiling at her expression. Plum is cool. He said, shrugging and putting his hands on the maroon thing they had just reached. Mika made an over-incredulous face at him, with one eye half open and the other wide, making the newly named Blue laugh. How about Violet? He asked tentatively. You're so smart. She squealed as he helped her up, beaming up at him ecstatically. So you can call me Violet, okay? She told him, brushing some of the strange slimy substance which oozed silently out of the thing they were now kneeling on. I prefer Mika. He answered unwillingly, wincing at the thought of her reaction. Violet doesn't sound much like you. He added, hoping to soften the blow. You had to be difficult, didn't you? She replied, sighing exasperatedly. She looked away for a moment, the boy knowing that she was disappointed, but she was trying to hide it. It's okay. You can call me Mika. She finished, smiling at him indulgently, which he returned. But I'm Blue, right? He asked, standing up and helping her to stand beside him, clutching his sleeves for support. She smiled at him uncertainly as she wobbled ominously, but he got the picture that she was okay with it all. He led her further into the field of squashy red cushions, holding her hand tight as she clung to him for security. He suddenly turned and started bouncing up and down, grinning at his little friend sheepishly. He let himself be bounced higher and higher, as though he was on a trampoline with a huge grin on his slightly uncertain face, trying to persuade her to join him. She laughed nervously, gingerly starting to bounce herself a little, her eyes glancing anxiously from her feet to the newly named Blue and back again as she got higher and more confidence. Soon she was bouncing nearly as high as her best friend, grinning just as wide as he was, the twinkle in their eyes shining brightly at each other in childish excitement. Their loud giggles echoed around the clearing as they both landed one after the other, Mika making her way closer to her best friend with a mischievous look in her deep hazel eyes. Blue watched her as she encroached lightly onto his mollusk, bouncing in different rhythms, her eyes shining in delight and mischief, the same look mirrored in his own deep blue eyes. They giggled at each other as the girl with the deep puce-colored hair caught up with the boy with the black hair, before she was finally at the same level as him, both laughing hard at each other's faces. Suddenly, Mika threw her young arms around the boy's waist, pulling him into a friendly embrace and making him look down at her wide-eyed in surprise and terror as they fell in slow motion back towards the ground. As the time slowed right down, they fell towards the dark red squishy thing below them, Mika's face comfortably content with being pressed against her best friend's chest, the boy's face worried about the fall as they tumbled in slow motion, leaning further and further onto the side, falling horizontally with the girl below Blue. They landed smoothly on the maroon-colored thing, Blue lying on top of Mika with a small smile on his face as they bounced up again, Mika lifting her face up to look him in the eyes. As they came back down again, their faces were bumped together, not painfully, but it was enough to make them both separate quickly, moving swiftly away from each other awkwardly. The girl shuffled hastily out from underneath her friend, the boy sitting up and smiling awkwardly at her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, shrugging uncomfortably at her sort of half-heartedly. She tried to smile, but it looked more like a painful wince. She could feel herself burning bright red and knew that he would be too, but she decided that it was best not to look up at him just yet. Shall we go home?" she asked, brushing her hair out of her eyes. "Good idea," she heard him say as she got up tentatively, but before she knew it she had slipped and was falling forwards with an empty space between two mollusks looming in front of her. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there he was. Blue's arms were there to catch her, keep her from falling into the 5-foot abyss. "Are you okay?" he asked as she clutched onto his t-shirt for dear life, her eyes wide in terror at what could have happened. It doesn't seem like a lot, but to a kid, 5 feet is huge. She smiled nervously up at him as he helped her get stable on the unstable maroon thing. "That could have been messy. I got so told off last time, I think Mom would have killed me if I did it again," exclaimed Blue with a laugh. Neither of them said anything, but it was almost painfully obvious that they were both really relieved that nothing had changed between them. It had been an accident that would never be repeated and never mentioned to anyone, especially not each other, despite the fact that both had found it strangely nice. Sakura yawned as she and the rest of Team 7 hung around outside the Hokage's office, waiting for Mika to come out. They could hear voices from the inside as the elderly leader of the Hidden Leaf Village spoke quietly to the young girl of her options, her pledge and her responsibilities. "They sure are taking a long time, huh?" said Naruto, clearly bored out of his brains, but the others ignored him as they usually tended to do. "Why is it taking this long? Surely old man Hokage can't be uncertain of letting her into the village, she's so nice." "Hands off, Naruto," said Sasuke menacingly, scowling over at him from the other side of Kakashi. "She may not remember it, but she's mine," he finished protectively, trying to threaten the blonde hyperactive boy into submission. "Hey, that's no fair," he cried out in anger. "She doesn't remember you, she's fair game," he shouted, getting more and more competitive. Both boys glared daggers at each other, trying to intimidate each other without using violence, knowing that the Hokage could come out at any moment. "Now boys," started Kakashi, feeling the painfully obvious tension between the three adolescents and trying to ease it a little. "She's not a possession, you know. You can't just talk about someone like she belongs to you. I thought you knew that," he added, going back to his book. "She seems to have taken a liking to you, Sasuke," he finished quietly. "Well duh," answered the rebellious boy defiantly. "We were made for each other. It's fate. We're meant to be together," he finished, folding his arms and looking away from the Jonin who rolled his dark eyes. "Or the one that we can see, anyway." "What's so special about her anyway?" asked Sakura, folding her arms and brooding moodily on the edge of the bench. "Inner Sakura. Cha. She's not even pretty. Plus I'm sure she copied on my hair color." "Well, if you were to take the time and get to know her instead of being a total bitch to her, maybe you'd understand," growled Sasuke frostily, his eyes narrowed as he looked past Kakashi and Naruto, hoping she could feel his cold stare. Sakura glanced over her shoulder, her eyes watering. "So, she's the same age as you?" asked the Jonin curiously, gazing over at his dark-haired student. Sasuke nodded, his face defiant despite the lack of reason to be so. He's so protective over her. Or maybe he's just possessive. Either way, it's not like him at all, he thought, still gazing at the boy in question. "She's better developed than you lot, isn't she? She's grown up very fast," he continued, looking back down at Icha Paradise quietly. "What's that supposed to mean?" asked Sasuke icily, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Kakashi could feel the weight of the teenager's mistrust on the side of his face and glanced at him uninterestedly, taking in what he was likely to do. "It's supposed to mean that she was very well endowed," he answered shortly, having worked out exactly how Sasuke would reciprocate and ready to counter it in an instant. As he had predicted, Sasuke ripped a kunai knife from his holster and tried to stab the Jonin in the neck with it while crying out in fury at him. Kakashi snapped his hand up, grabbed the young man's, and managed to turn him around into a half Nelson, with the knife jabbing gently into the back of his neck in the same ironic position he had forced Naruto into on their first day. But Sasuke kicked out with his leg, dangerously close to where Mika's flower bomb had got him, making the Jonin jump out of the way and release his hold on him. They stood in the large hallway glaring at each other, Sasuke's eyes full of hate, Kakashi's eyes relatively empty of most strong emotions. "Sasuke," he said calmly, still watching the talented genin closely. "She's 14 years younger than me. Plus she's my student. I couldn't touch her even if I wanted to," he explained steadily, trying to calm the protective boy down. The dark-eyed boy continued to glower at him, as though he would have liked nothing more than to have seen him in agony, but the sensei just smiled serenely. "Trust me." The young boy continued to stare at his sensei for a moment longer before standing up straight again and putting his kunai knife back in its holster where it belonged. Kakashi sat back down on the hard bench beside Sakura, whose bright green eyes were wide with fright, and smiled reassuringly. Naruto's stomach growled ominously. "Why are they taking so long?" he asked as he clutched his tummy, trying to silence himself and failing miserably. "All he's doing is telling her not to betray the village, right?" Nobody answered him. Kakashi was back into his book. Sakura was too busy watching Sasuke, who in turn was brooding sullenly, all too busy to care much what the hyperactive young ninja had to say. After 20 more minutes of waiting, the door finally opened and out came a tired-looking girl with a proud look on her face. In her right hand she was clutching a shining new forehead protector, in her left a small scroll and a huge grin on her face. Suddenly, Naruto noticed a small detail which he hadn't taken in earlier. "Hey, wait a second," he exclaimed, making the girl's smile disappear and a nervous expression replace it. "How come you've got a black forehead protector?" he asked, pointing at the object in question. Because I'm not a genin," she said a little awkwardly, shrugging and wincing slightly. "I passed the Chunin exam a while ago," she added, glancing from one curious face to the other and then the next one. "Why? Are you guys still genin?" she asked, surprised. But before anyone could answer, Kakashi cut in. "Where are you staying?" he asked, stepping in front of the hyperactive blonde boy, averting a possible conflict. The girl looked down at the ground, thinking, and then looked back up at the jonin, who was to be her new sensei for a while. "Do you know any cheap hotels?" she asked apologetically, wincing awkwardly. "And I mean really cheap, I kinda don't have any money," she explained ruefully, "you know, being found out in the woods and all. I didn't want to ask Miyuki for any more money after she looked after me for all those years." She finished, clearly feeling very uncomfortable. "You can stay with me," exclaimed Sasuke, his face lighting up with the prospect of having her with him for the whole night, but Kakashi was reluctant. "She can stay with me," he said forcefully, gazing down at the dark-eyed boy meaningfully. "I don't want them together at night, who knows what they could get up to," he thought quietly. "I have a spare room which is up and running, you can stay in there," he continued, turning to look at Mika. She smiled up at him gratefully, while Kakashi noticed Sasuke's intimidating glare frizzle almost electrically at him. Who knows what kinds of mischief they could cause. "Thank you, Kakashi-sensei," she said, still smiling sweetly at him, making it hard to believe that she could be such a troublemaker. "Nice-an," cried out the 4-year-old girl in frustration. Please let me try it." She bounced up on her tiptoes, but the older boy held the forehead protector just out of reach. "You're too little to try this, Imato," he said calmly, a malicious smile on his handsome face, his dark hair falling elegantly down his forehead and into his deep blue eyes. "When you get through the academy, then you'll get your own. But I want to try it on now," she whimpered piteously, still reaching for the precious piece of material with the treasured slice of shiny metal. "Mom, tell Yama to give me his headband." She whined over her shoulder at her mom, who was in the kitchen. Now, Mika," came Hachiko's smooth, friendly voice as she came through from the kitchen, wiping a newly cleaned plate with a cloth. "Your brother worked very hard for that. When you get one, you won't want to give it to anyone either." The little girl gasped incredulously, a look of disbelief on her young face. "But you're never going to get one," taunted the 11-year-old boy, tying the blue forehead protector up behind his neck proudly. "Because you're my girly little sister." The little 4-year-old girl turned to glower at her older brother as menacingly as she could. "I will become a ninja," she declared defiantly, putting her hands on her hips. "And I'll be a better ninja than you ever will be," she added before sticking her tongue out at him. In the background, Hachiko chuckled proudly at her 2 children before turning back into the kitchen, where her adoring husband was listening and smiling just as proudly as she was. Kakashi woke up quite suddenly when he heard a strange quiet noise. He sat up slowly, rubbing his sleepy eyes, wondering what the hell it was. He looked over at the clock and saw that it was nearly 1:30 in the morning, cursing the thing who woke him. He had been dreaming about Icha paradise, but he was awoken before anything decent had happened. He listened a little harder and came to realize that the small rhythmic sound was coming from his spare bedroom. He reached over and stiffly grabbed his mask, putting it on laboriously and swinging his legs over the side of the bed, leaning on them for a moment before standing up slowly, regretting it immensely, but made his way to the doorway. As he got closer, he became conscious of what the noise was. It was the unmistakable sound of quiet, badly stifled, young confused 13-year-old girl's tears. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly and trying to pull his pajama bottoms up a little over his naked chest, but to no avail, since the elastic had given way years ago. He peered around the open doorway into his spare room and there she was. Mika Tikik, crying into the pillow Kakashi had said she could sleep on, curled up on the floor on the other side of the bed, rocking herself back and forth miserably. He pushed the door a little further open and stood in it, watching the small girl as she swayed herself unhappily. He remembered the last time he had seen her this way. It seemed a lifetime away that he had watched the 7-year-old girl who had bumped into her best friend and fallen over. It pulled at his heartstrings to think of what his life had been like at that time and how much it had changed all in one night. But there she was. Trying to silence the tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, hardly visible in the moonlight, rocking herself gently and hiding her face in the down-filled pillow. Suddenly she became conscious that he was there, watching her silently as she sobbed quietly, her eyes all puffy and red. "I'm scared," she whimpered piteously, the tears still streaming out of her deep brown eyes. "I miss Miyuki," she added in a desperate sob as the 26-year-old made his way around the bed to stand above her. He lowered himself to her level, sitting down on his feet, he put his strong arms around her small frame and pulled her into a tight fatherly hug. He felt her small arms wrap themselves around his waist, making his skin tingle deliciously in a fatherly way and her press her small damp face into the crook of his neck. "Come here," he whispered, stroking her back comfortingly. He felt her shift her legs to face him completely, still quietly letting tears seep out of her eyes and down her cheeks. He gently put his arms around her and effortlessly picked her up, feeling her clutch at his neck for dear life and smiling at her fear. "What are you doing?" she whimpered piteously, fear and wretchedness as she clung to his smooth skin as he began to move out of the room and into the kitchen. He put her down gently onto one of the deep blue cushions placed on all four sides of his small kitchen table before busying himself getting her a cup of warm cocoa and a tissue. After a few minutes of sitting in companionable silence, sipping their mugs of cocoa, Mika finally broke the comfortable silence with a very shaky and subdued voice. "What's wrong with your eye?" she sniffled, rubbing her nose with the back of her sleeve, reminding him of something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Your left one," she added, thinking that he may not have understood. "It was a gift," he explained quietly, watching her over the brim of his brightly colored mug. "By a very good friend of mine. It has the Sharingan." He took a deep breath, ready to explain to her what it was after having seen her blank face. "It's a gift that very few people have, mainly the Uchihas, but as I said it was given to me by a very good friend." "So, does Sasuke have it?" asked the girl, her eyes slowly unpuffing and her nose progressively stopping sniffling. "He's an Uchiha, right? Why did you say Uchihas? I thought he was the last one." "Oh no, his brother." She corrected herself quickly. "So what does it do?" "Yes, Sasuke has it," answered Kakashi, putting his empty mug back down on the table in front of him. "It enables the user to see what their opponent's next move before they have even decided it and copy it perfectly, even after the battle is over. It's a very useful talent to have because you can, how can I say this?" He looked away, his forehead creased slightly in thought as Mika continued to watch him, enthralled in the wisdom the Jonin was imparting on her. "Steal, I think, is the best word for here. Yes. It means you can steal your adversary's techniques and use them for your own means." Whoa, came the girl's impressed reaction as she took in the full extent of the power her new best friend had at the tips of his fingertips. "Well, eyes." She yawned deeply and the 26-year-old man smiled underneath his mask. "Time for bed," he said, standing up and reaching over to pick up her empty mug, turning back around to put both into the sink, which was already full of dirty plates and cutlery. Mika stood up and stood where she was for a moment, looking helpless and lost. Kakashi-sensei," she started, almost so quietly the older man didn't hear. He looked over his shoulder at her as he tried to fit the mugs into his sink, making a small moaning noise, letting her know that he was listening. She mumbled a few incoherent things before the man worked out what she was on about. "Would you like to sleep with me?" he asked with his fists on his hips and an understanding look on his handsome face, his fatherly instinct kicking in painfully. The girl looked up again with an apologetic yet grateful look in her yet again teary brown eyes. He smiled kindly at her, remembering her when she was little. Her happy little face as he watched her running around with her little friend, her friendly laugh when she was discovered with her best friend, sneakily spying on various people including him. He led the way back into his room, feeling slightly awkward that he was leading a 13-year-old to his bed, especially since she was his new student. When they got into the square room, its deep blue walls with various ornamental Japanese pictures and paintings. He discreetly pulled down the picture he had torn out of some previous Icha Paradise magazine, which he had pinned up to the wall. He noticed the girl smiling over at him pleasantly, as though she knew what he had just done. "Well, he said quietly, feeling intensely awkward that he was inviting such a young girl into his bed. Before he could finish, Mika had crawled into the bed and was sitting there with the cover up over the lower part of her face, and the visible part had a benign smile perceptible on it. He slowly got in and shuffled down in, getting comfortable in his own bed with the young girl who was watching him sweetly from under the cover. Bakashi smiled at her kindly, feeling the paternal instinct kick in powerfully, while her tear-stricken face continued to smile over at him. He felt compelled to look after her, just as the father she had lost would have, and the same way he would have done with the child he was so close to having, but was denied only months after he had become aware of its existence. He watched her close her deep brown eyes comfortably as she settled down to go to sleep and let his own eyelids droop and close, rolling over onto his other side and thumping his pillow into a more secure position. Suddenly he felt her move closer and felt her small frame press against his back, her small hands pressed in between both their bodies. He was surprised to find that it was strangely reassuring to have the small figure pressed against his back, the rhythmic movement of her breathing gradually lulling him into a very deep and comfortable sleep. Mika ran as fast as she could, screaming at the top of her tiny 3-year-old lungs, hoping that might put off her pursuer. Yama chased her around the dusty courtyard between all the houses which made up the small Tikka hamlet, bent over double with his hands held out in a half-hearted attempt to catch his sister, who was 7 years his junior. Yama darling, came his mom's voice from the front door of their family home, a large round bowl in one hand, a wooden spoon in the other, and an anxious look on her beautiful face. Be careful with your little sister, won't you? Leave them be, Hachiko. Came Chikichi's voice from behind her. She looked over her shoulder and saw her husband coming out with a bag in his hand, looking out of the door at his 10-year-old son. Besides, the Uchihas will be here any minute, so she'll be entertained, and I'm going to go and work on Yamazaki. He held up the bag and jingled it happily as the young boy stopped jazzing his sister. Isn't the eldest son coming? Asked a woman curiously, stirring the contents of her bowl absent-mindedly. And I'd rather you were here when they arrived. Chikichi snapped his head around to look at his wife in dismay. Can't you train with him another day? Yama decided that jazzing his sister was a lot more interesting than this conversation. But Koichi, he pleaded, making him painfully resemble his 10-year-old son. We always train on Sundays, it makes sure he's in tip-top form for Monday at the academy. Oh please, Amasan. She implored, trying to make her face as piteous as she could. The husband scares me, please don't leave me. She finished, knowing perfectly well that she had convinced him. Yama noticed from his very slow chase that his parents were moving closer together, their lips ominously close to each other's. The 10-year-old rolled his eyes exasperatedly as he heard the sound of footsteps, foretelling that their guests had arrived. Suddenly Mika was on the edge of the small yet yawning pond in the middle of the courtyard, dangerously close to falling in. Before anyone could get to her, she had slipped on one of the protruding bits of deep green algae on the damp rock surrounding it. There was a collective intake of breath as she tumbled backwards, aimed directly at the deep fish pond where several large fish were swimming, completely oblivious to the fact that the little girl was in imminent danger. But as the guests came around the corner of the large wooden gate, a thick root-like piece of vegetation shot out of the ground, just where her feet had been, and managed to wrap itself around the small free-falling body and prevent the near misfortune. The Uchihas stood in the gate, their eyes wide in surprise and awe, as their eyes moved slowly from the 3-year-old girl giggling sweetly as the root grasped her securely by the waist, to Hachiko, whose hand was outstretched in a grasping position towards the girl, and a surprised look on her pretty face. The large bowl lay smashed and forgotten on the ground at her feet. The next morning, Mika and Sasuke were meandering along the marketway, chatting and every now and then having a look at the scrawny and cheap objects on sale. From behind the counters, salespeople called out, trying to make a meager sale to the two young people, but in vain. Sasuke glowered at the salesman who had attempted to make a pass at a newly blushing Mika as they swiftly walked away. Asshole. He mumbled under his breath as they both turned off in the direction of the park. Mika smiled at him sideways through her awkward blush, but it was obvious that she was grateful. I'll get him, I'll hurt him. Sasuke, it's okay. She comforted him quietly, her small smile still etched gently on her friendly lips. It's not the first time, it's just that I'm not very good at dealing with it. She finished awkwardly, shrugging as they pushed the gate to the children's park and passing through it. Hey Sasuke. Mika. Came a familiar friendly cry. The teenage couple looked up and saw, among others, Naruto sitting on a swing moving back and forth rhythmically with a huge grin on his face and his hand in the air in a welcoming wave. Let's get out of here before they catch us. Mumbled the dark-haired boy under his breath as he tried to turn back, but the girl grabbed hold of his upper arm. When he looked up, he saw a reassuring smile on her pretty face and immediately knew what she wanted. She looked back over at the boys on the swings with a friendly smile and waved back at Naruto. As they made their way over to the boys, Sasuke slightly on the unwilling side, Mika had time to take them all in. There was Naruto, sitting on one of the two swings with one arm lazily entwined with the cord holding him up and the other still waving enthusiastically at her. Then there was a brown-haired boy with a ponytail and a bored look on his face, his crop jacket barely covering his fishnet shirt beneath it and his hands in his pockets. Beside him, sitting on the floor, was a slightly bigger-built boy who was greedily tucking into a packet of potato chips, his headband reminding Mika painfully of a pair of knickers on his head. Then sitting on the other swing was the last boy, sporting two purple lines leading from his eyes down his cheeks and wearing a fur-covered parka. Mika also noticed the very small dog sprawled over the top of the last boy's head, looking very comfortable as the whole group watched her and Sasuke's progress towards them. When they got to the swings, Naruto stood up and motioned for Mika to take his place on the swing he had just dismounted in a very gentlemanlike gesture. The girl with the plum-colored hair blushed again, damn it, just after she got over the last time. And sat down obligingly, smiling up at the blonde boy with the strange markings on his face. "Thanks," she said quietly, feeling the looks of all the guys on her, judging her as though she was a poodle on display at some stuck-up dog show. So how are you this morning?" she asked, trying to break the awkward silence which was beginning to encroach on them. "Oh, yeah," exclaimed Naruto, as though he had forgotten something. Sasuke sighed exasperatedly and rolled his steely blue eyes to the sky and then fixed them back on Mika with a look that said, "This was your idea. This is Shikamaru Nara," started Naruto, putting his arm around the shoulders of the boy with the ponytail. The boy in question didn't break a smile, but just gazed at Mika as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world but here. "This is Kiba and Yuzuka and Akamaru," continued Naruto happily, indicating the other boy on the swings and the dog on his head. This boy did smile, but Mika could have sworn she saw fangs protruding from beneath his upper lip. "And that is Choji Akimichi," finished Naruto, jabbing his thumb over his shoulder at the boy who was still munching away at his chips. He tried to say something, but every time he opened his mouth a load of crisps came flying out, so he decided against a friendly hello. "I Mika Tikik," answered the shy girl, trying to smile in a friendly way, but it turned into a sort of uncomfortable grimace. I just got here yesterday, and suddenly she got another flash thing. She was running away from someone, but it was a game, probably catch, and she was running through this park. She ran past the swings where she noticed two boys swinging beside each other. She recognized them to be Shikamaru and Choji." "Mika, was it?" came an unfamiliar voice, snapping the girl back into reality where she found she was staring wide-eyed and open-mouthed at the sky just above Naruto's right shoulder. She noticed that both he, Sasuke and Shikamaru were all watching her with nervous looks. "Are you okay?" asked the boy she knew to be called Shikamaru. I just got a flashback thingy," she told them, so quietly she was surprised they actually heard her. I kinda lost my memory, so this is all really new to me, even though I was born here and grew up here." "Memory loss, huh?" repeated Shikamaru with one hand in his pocket and the other scratching the back of his neck. "What a drag," he finished, closing his eyes and looking vaguely in the direction of Mika's feet. "You have no idea," answered the girl with a dark look. Naruto smiled understandingly at her, Shikamaru looked up with a hint of a bored smile, and Choji stopped munching for a moment to actually look at her. "OMG. So if you grew up here," started Kiba with a puzzled frown. "How come we haven't seen you around?" he asked, looking straight at her. "Well, actually you did see me, but a long time ago," she told them all. "That was kinda in my flashback thing. I remembered running through this park and seeing you." She pointed at Shikamaru and him. She made a strange hand movement in the direction of Choji, "sitting here on the swings watching me run past," she told them. "Yeah, but I never forget a pretty face, so that must have been ages ago," said Choji, finally looking up at her. Mika blushed when she thought that he was paying attention to her, but then she noticed that his packet of crisps was lying limp on the floor, clearly obliterated by his hungry rampage. "Yeah, loads of kids have run past him and me while we were sitting here," added Shikamaru, folding his arms as he swayed onto the other foot. "Where have you been lately?" "I've been in the Hidden Grass Village," she explained, feeling a little insecure as the boys continued to interrogate her mercilessly. "A woman from that village found me and looked after me for about 4 years," she finished. "Lay off her," cut in Sasuke before anyone else could ask any more questions about her past. "She's new in this village, okay? And Kakashi-sensei told us to act as though she has never been here and we have never seen here before. Now give her a break." "So how come that rule doesn't seem to affect you?" asked Naruto loudly, his hands balled into fists. The static between the two boys was almost visible as they glared at each other, both wishing that the other would fall down dead right there and then. "Hey, wait. I think I know you," said Kiba suddenly, staring at her intently, his brow slightly furrowed. Mika looked at him curiously, hoping that maybe this could help her remember a bit more. "You were at the academy, weren't you?" he asked, his forehead furrowing even more. "You were always hanging out with Sasuke." He finished, punching the air triumphantly, almost making Akamaru fall off, but not quite, a look of utter terror on his little doggy face. "Was I?" she asked, a look of utter bewilderment on her pretty face. Kiba nodded enthusiastically at her, but her face stayed vague on the blank side. She looked up at Sasuke for help and he nodded diffidently, letting her know that the boy with the strange dog fetish was right. You? Mika, isn't it? Came an unfamiliar girl's voice. The small group of youths looked over to the gate and saw a blonde girl standing there in a very strong-looking position. Maybe, answered Mika nervously, getting to her feet. Why? What have I done this time? She asked as all the boys around her watched Ino, glowering at her. You just barge in here and expect everyone to like you? She cried out angrily, walking swiftly over to where Mika was standing between Naruto and Sasuke. Well, I'm Ino Yamanaka, and I'm here to burst your bubble. I'm here to fight you. She finished flicking her long blonde hair over her shoulder dramatically. I'm only average, whimpered the girl with the puce-colored hair anxiously. I'm not very good. I don't care. Answered Ino, flexing her arms and cracking her knuckles before wincing in pain, quickly adopting her previous stature. I'm really good, so prepare to be defeated. Suddenly an idea crossed her mind. Mika got the distinct impression that it was painful. Not many ideas had passed that way before. Wait, I've got an idea, she said mystically. Shikamaru snickered and nudged Choji in the ribs meaningfully. That's a first, he whispered, so only the people around him could hear. Mika tried not to giggle in the face of a nasty-looking battle with no dress sense. If I win, continued Ino, pointing at Mika. You have to leave Sasuke alone. She said before winking at, one can only hope, the dark-haired boy standing in front of Mika. If you win, I might leave you alone. I never asked for anything, protested Mika desperately. He's the one who came to me. Not the other way around. She cried out. Sasuke looked over his shoulder at her nervous face. Not that I'm complaining or anything, she added quickly. She didn't want to lose what looked like her only friend. Ino, drop it, said Shikamaru in the slow drawl which defined his voice. She's not stealing your precious Sasuke, not that he's yours or anything. He added, closing his eyes in exasperation. The blonde girl fumed furiously at him, but he ignored her. Well, he's more mine than hers. She yelled furiously, her hands in fists at shoulder level. They just met. Actually, we've been friends since we were little. Contradicted Sasuke darkly, glaring at Ino as though she was a nasty-looking bug which he didn't want to have to touch. Enough, bellowed Ino, trying to override what he had just said. Now fight me. There was a pause during which the blonde girl adopted a malicious smile. Or are you too frightened? Mika's eyes slowly narrowed to irate slits. You wish. She growled, just loud enough for her to hear. Sasuke looked over his shoulder at her with a surprised look on his face. She glanced at him quickly, her expression resolute as she walked determinedly past him and towards Ino. Mika stood in front of her opponent, her hands hanging by her sides and a nervous yet determined expression adorning her face. Ino clenched her fists and held them up in front of her pretty face, relishing the thought of being able to humiliate this new girl who was trying to muscle her way in between her and Sasuke. The girl with the plum-colored stood with her feet about 1.5 feet apart. Haha. Get it? Foot. Feet. I kill myself. Her left hand was balled into a fist at chin level, and her right hand in a motion which could be mistaken for the halt sign, but her fingers were bent over in half a sign of the boar. Ready to be demolished? Asked Ino threateningly. I was about to ask the same question, replied Mika, a hint of a smile in her clearly nervous voice. Suddenly Ino ran at the brown-eyed girl, swung her right fist at her and missed. Mika ducked and kicked out, hitting her foe squarely in the shin so quickly that nobody saw. Ino found herself lying face down in the dust with very sore shins. The others suddenly let out a collective intake of breath about 3 seconds after it had happened. I'm so sorry, cried Mika suddenly, dropping to her knees and trying to help Ino up, but the blonde girl just elbowed her angrily. I thought you said you were good. She whimpered apologetically. I am, cried Ino furiously, sitting up and glowering at her wrathfully. You said you weren't, she added incredulously, getting to her feet again and taking the defensive stance. I'm only average, mumbled Mika uncomfortably, taking her battle position again. But you're even worse than me, she finished with an apologetic tone. Ino growled angrily as she ran forwards for a second attack. She kicked out with her left leg, but Mika dodged left, letting the leg pass beside her quite comfortably. Ino threw out her fist, but Mika grabbed it with her wrist, twisted her around, and managed to shoulder her over her deep plum head of hair and onto the ground. Sorry, she whimpered apologetically, a rueful look on her face as she gazed down at Ino as she tried to get herself up, a look of pure hatred on her pretty face. Could you try a bit harder, please? I feel really bad kicking your butt. You're supposed to enjoy it, Mika, cried Naruto, his face grinning as he laughed at her awkwardness. Kick her butt, Mika, he added. Mika winced as she tried to smile gratefully. Ino kicked her in the back as she got back to her feet. Mika spun around and thumped her in the face, making the blonde girl clutch her nose in pain. Mika ran at her, kicking and punching at the same time with opposite members, forcing Ino to back down before she finally fell backwards, crying out for Mika to stop. Okay. Stop. She cried out as Mika pulled her right fist back for yet another punch, but she restrained herself. You win, please. Are you gonna leave Sasuke and me alone now? She asked, grabbing the blonde girl by her baggy purple top and lifting her off of the ground, baring her white teeth. Ino nodded frantically, anxious that the girl release her, which she did. Mika dropped her cargo unceremoniously and walked off towards the small group of boys, smiling awkwardly. Well managed Choji as his newly opened packet of potato chips hung forgotten in his left hand and his mouth hung open. The same sort of look was also covering the other boys' faces as they watched her walk slowly back over to them. I guess I won, she said quietly, shrugging and smiling uneasily in front of the disbelieving gazes. Lou, as his best friend fondly liked to call him, was running leisurely through the square heading towards the designated meeting place, not too fast as to wear himself out, but he was still running. She had said that she had a secret to show him, something that only he could see and that he wasn't allowed to tell anyone about. It was his 5th birthday tomorrow and he hoped that she wouldn't get him into trouble just before his big day. It was alright for her. She wasn't always competing for attention with her brother. He knew he was getting a brand new set of shuriken and kunai knives as a gift from his parents and he was very excited about it. His first set of weapons. And not those wimpy plastic ones they give little kids to play with, these were real. It was a beautiful sunny July day, the shadows from the trees he was running below dancing off him as he dashed past. The sound of birdsong could be heard even by a scampering kid. He ran past the academy, feeling the impressive aura it was giving off. Soon he would be going there, he couldn't wait. Finally he would be taken seriously by his father, finally he could start to catch up to his older brother, finally he. Hey Blue. Came his best friend's familiar voice from away to his left. He stopped and saw her waving at him, a big smile across her face, a red ribbon hanging limp from a strand of her deep plum-colored hair, her white t-shirt fluttering as she waved frantically, and her purple shorts quivering in the gentle summer breeze. He ran over to her grinning, his own hand in the air in a forthcoming gesture. Niacin has gone off on a mission. She told him when they met up halfway, her mouth was stretched elegantly in a wide grin, showing that she was thrilled that they were together again. So? He asked, wondering what the big deal was. My Niacin goes away all the time on missions. He comes back, don't worry. He added, thinking that maybe she was worried about her brother, but he highly doubted so due to her grin. Dad and Mom have asked me if I want you and your family to come and have supper with us, and Mom can show you the Tikik traditional dance. She continued as though she hadn't heard what he had said. The little boy's face lit up, he could feel his face breaking into a huge grin of its own will, his eyes so scrunched up to give more room for his smile to get even bigger that he was finding it difficult to actually see her, but he did notice her going bright red and dismissed it. And why would I be worried about Yama? She added, her face suddenly puzzled. I'm going to go and ask Dad and Mom. Cried the dark-eyed boy excitedly, bouncing on the balls of his feet for a few moments before turning tail and tearing off to go and ask whether they could. He ran faster than he had in a very long time. Mika had told him about the Tikik dance before and shown him a few of the dance moves that her mom had shown her, but he'd never seen the whole thing. Mika was too young to learn the dance, but she had copied a few techniques which she'd seen her mom using, and she had also seen the outfit they wore too. The Tikik dance had been passed down from generation to generation by the women of the family. It was a sign of being to control one's power perfectly, and so shown to close friends of the family with much honor and pride. Mika was not even 5 yet and was just starting to discover her talent with water, but she was developing fast, and Hachiko had told her that she would have to start learning the dance soon. The nearly 5-year-old boy skidded to a halt as he got to his home, leapt inside, banging his ankle on the wooden doorway, but he ignored the pain, kicked off his sandals and hurried inside looking for his parents. Dad. Mom. He cried desperately, the grin on his face still stuck fast. Mom. Where are you? He cried, trying not to slow down as he scurried round the corner and headed towards the kitchen. There he found his mom with an anxious yet inquisitive face. What is it, Shigo? She asked in a worried tone as she bent down to his level. Have you hurt yourself again? Oh, look at your ankle. The boy looked down at his ankle, which now that she mentioned it, was throbbing, and noticed that it had swollen right up and was oozing a strange yellowish liquid. Mom. He said, excitement overriding the pain in his ankle as he gasped for breath. Can we go? Let me fix that, continued Mikoto, not listening to her son. Sit down and take the weight off it. She indicated a chair and the boy sat down obligingly, trying to get his breath back. Mika's family has invited us to see their dance. He managed finally as his mom tied a cool bandage around his throbbing foot after having rubbed some ointment on. The attractive woman looked up from her son's sore foot with a surprised and apologetic expression covering her even features. Oh, Shigo, she started, clearly troubled at something. The boy's face fell automatically, he thought he knew what had happened. I'm so sorry, your father, she tried to lessen the blow, but the little boy's eyes filled with tears. But Mom. he exclaimed as he wiped away furious tears which were welling up in his deep steely blue eyes. Please. Make Dad go, he begged, but the woman shook her head. IG, she continued, her face miserably resolute. Your brother is home and your father wants to have supper with him. And that was final. Mika giggled meekly as Naruto told her about the time he had saved Sasuke's sorry butt in the forest of death during the Chunin exam when some weird woman attacked them with a giant snake. Beside her the dark-haired boy fumed, glaring at the boy with the whisker marks on his cheeks. They were sitting at the same bar where she had first met him, Sasuke and her with a bowl of half-eaten ramen in front of them. Naruto had 3 empty bowls and a fourth which he was just finishing off. So then munch, Sasuke was like, here, have the damn thing, and I was like, munch, what did you do with Sasuke? 'Cause you know, he never gives up and all believe it. He explained through mouthfuls of ramen, while Mika politely tried to dodge the bits which were flying at her. You forgot to mention when you got beaten up by that masked ninja. Pointed out Sasuke trying to put his teammate down. But Naruto ignored him. And then munch, I had to stop the giant snake from eating him there and then. Continued the blonde boy, smiling proudly. He was too scared. Suddenly Sasuke stood up, his face livid and his hands clenched into angry fists. Mika could have sworn he was going to hit Naruto right there, and by the looks of it so did Naruto, but he just strode off angrily back into the crowded street. I'd better you know, muttered Mika as she got up from her stool, wincing a little awkwardly at her friend. Naruto didn't complain, his mouth was full of ramen, and he'd been inches away from a near-death experience right now, all he needed was more ramen. Mika ran after Sasuke into the crowded street, trying to crane her neck to see over all the people who were meandering along, minding their own business, making purchases and various other things people do in streets. She called out for him, but she got no reply. She pushed her way along the road, trying to get past everyone without too much hassle, but to no avail. A sea of heads bobbing in the opposite direction pushed her away from where she had last seen Sasuke heading like a strong current on a stormy day, leading a ship away from the safety of the port. Sasuke. She cried out again, feeling as though her only link to her past was swiftly fading into darkness, and the only person she could relate to was swiftly growing tired of her. Please, Sasuke, she called out, feeling the tearing sensation in her throat telling her to cry, hearing the sound of her voice as it wavered and cracked with emotion. Please, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She didn't know why this was so painful. She was still being led down the street by the crowd, who didn't seem to care that she had let tears creep down her cheeks. Sasuke, don't leave me. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her throat rasping with emotion, her eyes closed against the tears and hostile glares of all the strangers around her, her hand outstretched, hoping that she might yet be saved. And there it was. She felt warm, reassuring fingers entwining with hers, promising safety, promising security, promising the world. She locked her fingers in his hand and felt his lock with hers, promising her she'd be alright. She opened her eyes and there he was, smiling at her comfortingly with soft eyes, and his hair undulating gently as the masses passed them by, ignoring them. He pulled her gently, yet powerfully, closer to him and put his arms around her shoulder, drawing her into a passionate, loving hug. A hug which simply screamed, I don't know what I did without you. From both parties. She interlaced her arms through his, around his back, so that her hands were placed on either shoulder blade, and her face was nuzzled securely in the crook of his neck. They could have stayed there forever. Their arms interlocked and their faces close. His head lay gently on top of her plum-colored hair which smelled faintly of cherry, her face placed on his shoulder with her chin level with his collarbone. The crowded street was suddenly empty. They were alone, 2 kids against the world. The 2 children sneaked through the shadows, heading towards the safety of the swarming street where they could finally escape. Mika kept her small trembling hand into his for reassurance, feeling his fingers close on hers, making her feel a lot safer, though the adrenaline making her whole body shake. The dark-haired boy turned and smiled at his younger accomplice, the same emotions pumping through his 6-year-old veins, his breath shuddering, but his smile stuck firmly on his lips. If we run, we can make it, he told her under his breath, nodding convincingly at the nervous-looking girl. She looked over her shoulder at where her friend's older sister was sitting, writing something down when she was supposed to be watching them. She won't look up, promised the boy. Mika turned back to him and smiled mischievously. The 2 children snuck around the corner of the gate, out of sight of the babysitter and into the street, running as fast as they could in the direction of her house, where all their parents were having a grown-up conversation with Mika's best friend's older brother. Apparently they were talking about his and Mika's future, but the young girl was annoyed that they hadn't included her in this conversation, which did have something to do with her, and she couldn't do it without Blue. A 6-year-old boy climbed over the wall and fell nimbly on his feet in the long grass. Beside him the girl landed with a small oomph before falling down to her hands and knees. He leant over and helped her up, and they ran off again. She giggled a bit, letting him take her hand and lead her away, picking up their feet as they tried to get through the grass, which was swiftly getting higher than their heads. They finally managed to battle their way through the long-grassed meadow after several trips and bumps and made it onto the safety of the dirt road, which was the only link from Konoha to the Tikka hamlet. They walked slowly along, hand in hand, catching their breath and trying to work out what they were going to do when they got there. A few minutes passed unhurriedly and they found themselves outside the door of the dining room, listening to the door. Mika could hear her parents talking about her and comparing her to her older brother. She was satisfied to hear them mentioning that she had better potential than he had at her age. "Yes, our second child has the most potential too," came the boy's father's voice, booming around the room and bouncing off of the doors Mika and her best friend had their ears pressed against. "Our only daughter was a disappointment, I'm afraid," he finished, making Blue wince theatrically at Mika, who stifled a giggle. "But our youngest could turn out very impressive. Mika is going to be a great shinobi," came her future husband's deep enthralling voice. "She's training very hard and when she has mastered her talent, she'll be formidable." Mika grinned at her best friend, pride gushing through every fiber of her small being. "As will my brother," finished the older boy, a smile in his voice. "You can say I have potential, but he will be better than me." "So, why did you pass the chewing exam before us?" asked Sasuke as he watched Mika swing a thin stick back and forth absent-mindedly by her side, while they both walked leisurely around Konoha vaguely looking at the sights, not that either were very interested. They were merely meandering around to be together. "Because when I was taken to Kusa-no-Kuni, they didn't know how old I was," explained the girl, whipping the head off of some weeds inattentively, a small polite smile playing across her lips. "And when I developed earlier than the other girls I had been put with, they guessed I was older than them. 2 years actually," she said with a small giggle. "It's kinda weird being told first that you're 2 years older than you thought you were, then being told that you're not kinda messes you up," she finished shrugging a little. They both looked up at the Hokage's faces silently, respect etched in their eyes and on their faces. Sasuke tore his eyes away from the impressive monument and glanced sideways at the girl next to him who was frowning, puzzlement stretched across her pretty face. He wondered whether to ask her what was on her mind, but shyness took a strong hold of him and he decided to stay silent, hoping that she would tell him herself. He watched as she took a deep breath, closing her eyes and looking in the direction of the foot of the cliff, but he knew she wasn't seeing anything. "Okay, put on a sad song now. This is supposed to be really emotional for Mika, so you know yes I am talking to you. It helps." Every now and then she started, clearly apprehensive of what she was about to tell him. "I get these flashes of memory like when you had a dream and you can only remember snippets like a picture," she explained, still not opening her stunning chocolatey eyes. "I just got one of those," she finished quietly, finally looking up at him. Sasuke noticed that her eyes were watering, the tears welling up quickly, threatening to overflow. "I saw an older boy," she told him, the tears audible in her straining voice as she tried to force them to subside. "He had dark brown hair, blue eyes. Was that my brother?" Was that she paused, trying to keep the tears at bay, but they were quietly winning. "Yama," she finished, the tears finally defeating her and rolling down her cheeks as she spoke the name of her older brother for the first time in over 3 years. "Probably," answered Sasuke after a pause as he tried to remember what her brother had looked like. "What was he doing?" he asked, trying to work out whether it was Yama and not one of her cousins. Mika sniffed, trying to hide how emotional she really was, but the tears kinda gave it away. We were looking up at the faces," she started, looking back up at the 4 faces staring down at the sternly. "I was really little, he looked about 8 or something." She wiped her nose on the back of her gloved hand before continuing. "He was explaining something to me and pointing at the faces." She kept taking deep steadying breaths to try and stem the perpetual flow of tears rolling down her cheeks. "He picked me up." She gave a meek unconvincing laugh, but her face was contorted in sorrow. "He was smiling at me, he poked me in the nose." With this final detail, she dropped the charade of strength and fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. Sasuke knelt down next to her and awkwardly pulled her into an embarrassed embrace, feeling her back and shoulders heave as she continued to cry. He felt her suddenly wrap her arms around his stomach and push her face into his chest, still sobbing pathetically, so he placed his head on her back, bent over her protectively. "I can't even remember him," she cried out suddenly, the pain horribly obvious in her voice which was contorted into desperate agony. They sat there for at least 10 minutes while she gradually calmed down until Sasuke could have sworn that she had fallen asleep, but she sat up again, her eyes all red and swollen. She smiled uneasily at him as they sat opposite each other, their hands in their laps, because they didn't know what to do with them. "Sorry," she whispered with embarrassment, shrugging a little and not meeting his eye. "I must look horrible." She wiped her eyes with her fingers at the same time as wiping her cheeks with her palms. "Great, I have to cry in front of the hottest guy in the world, that's just perfect," she thought furiously. "It's okay," said the boy awkwardly, still gazing at her affectionately as she tried to tidy herself up. Girls are allowed to cry. You saw me cry. Now that's embarrassing. He joked. She giggled, forgetting about her face, which was definitely looking better than it had a moment ago. Your whole family was killed and then I come here and can't remember anything. She said quickly, trying to make him feel better. You have more of a right to cry than I do. They both smiled at each other companionably, not knowing what else to say. Sasuke got to his feet and held out his hand for Mika to take, which she did, standing up and brushing the dust off of her clothes at the same time. They set off in the opposite direction, away from the Hokage's faces, and that little incident which had, yet again, brought them even closer. As they walked down an unused side street, Mika glanced sideways at the boy walking next to her before looking straight out ahead of her, narrowly dodging a dustbin. Sasuke glanced nervously at the girl walking beside him as she barely missed an empty dustbin, trying to psych himself up to do something he hadn't done for so long. His heart raced as he decided to go for it. It suddenly jumped into his throat where it pounded uncomfortably. Mika was looking straight ahead of her, unaware that he was having an inward battle between his heart and his muscles. Suddenly she looked sideways at him, a small innocent and grateful smile on her lips, which made Sasuke go weak at the knees for the first time in an age. He tried to smile back but to his dismay, it came out as a pained grimace. She looked away, clearly thrown by his reaction, a confused and slightly wounded look on her pretty face. Sasuke hated himself for making her look that way. He closed his eyes as they turned right into a larger deserted street, took a deep reassuring breath as he decided to do it. He opened his eyes again, glanced at her apprehensively, then forced his muscles to do his bidding. Mika felt the soft touch of skin from a nervous finger as it hesitantly searched for a comfortable way to take her hand. She opened her fingers and let the boy's fingers entwine gently with hers, the reassuring warmth of skin on skin, making both teenagers a little uncomfortable, but neither would ever have dreamt of letting go. She looked up and saw Sasuke looking at their hands in mild surprise, his cheeks slowly burning into a healthy red blush as she felt her own cheeks going scarlet, but she smiled as he looked up at her, disbelief etched on his blushing face. He smiled back at her, and this time it was the easiest thing to do. I am not pathetic, screamed the furious 7-year-old Mika, glowering wrathfully at her older brother who was laughing maliciously. I'm just as good as you. The two siblings had been left at home while their parents went off to buy seedling vegetables with Mika's uncle Kiteru. You'll never be as good as me, he told her teasingly, working her up into an angry frenzy. Because you're just a little girl. He finished with a mock-pitying look. She gritted her teeth and growled in frustration, trying to decide whether to break the rules and use her waterfall against him. She could see that he was also trying to settle on whether she was going to use it and therefore whether he could. Dad says I have more potential than you do. She shouted at him, trying to get him to use his power before her so that she wouldn't be in the wrong. She saw that it had touched a nerve, his dark blue eye twitched in rage, and he brushed his dark-haired fringe out of his eyes with an elegant sweeping movement and fought with himself against using his electricity. They both knew they were equally powerful as each other, electricity and water mixing with intense energy, strong enough to blow the hamlet they lived in up. In the same fraction of a second, they both made the decision to start a full-blown fight with each other. A wall of water rose at least 5 yards in the air, crashing down beside the girl with a distinctive sound of water on hard ground, her fists clenched as she controlled the gallons and gallons of water. Two thunderbolts stabbed down on either side of the 14-year-old boy as he held his hands up in the air and a look of concentration crept over his handsome face. They stood there for a moment, working up the courage to actually making a move, reluctant to go first and have all the blame put on them, the power and concentration of strength, making both children feel awkward yet formidable. A second later Yama threw his right hand forwards, leading the lightning on that side rocket forwards at his little sister, but before it had got less than a yard forwards, a wall of water slipped between the bolt and the girl with a mighty elegance, which would have reminded any onlookers of a large Shire horse. The water sucked electricity in and rushed towards Yama menacingly, but he used the substitution jutsu to replace himself with a large log. That's not fair. She cried out indignantly with an infuriated scowl on her young face. I haven't learnt it yet. She glanced around her, painfully aware that he could be hiding anywhere around her. She ran her hands around her, directing the wall of water all around the yard, making sure she didn't damage anything in the process. Suddenly, she felt a pair of hands around her ankles, grasping her firmly and pulling her downwards. She screamed as she felt the cold dirt encroach all over her body, ruffling her clothes and slipping down the back of them and into her underwear uncomfortably. She opened her eyes again and saw Yama towering over her with a satisfied and proud expression on his handsome face as he brushed his hair out of his eyes. He clicked his fingers and a third bolt landed just behind him and slowly made its way towards the little girl's face. Mom. Dad. She cried desperately, terrified that her older sibling would go through with it. Grandmom. Help. She screamed out, unable to move her body other than her head which writhed in terror. What's going on out here? came a shaky voice from behind Yama. Mika craned her neck to see whose voice had saved her, although she already knew who it was, as Yama turned around with an anxious look on his face. "Grandmom!" cried the 7-year-old from her position at ground level. "Grandmom, he attacked me. He was going to kill me," she yelled out, her chest being slowly crushed. "Grandmom, help." Suddenly Yama was thrown over by a large amount of water which crashed over him, pinning him down, but holding his head up over the top, so he was in no immediate danger. The old woman hobbled over with her walking stick, her scrunched up eyes moving from the girl whose head was just above the ground to the boy whose head was perilously close to the water. She was muttering grumpily as usual, her feet still comfortably sitting in their inside slippers as she shuffled over to them. "Come on, you weak thing," she said in her harsh voice, scowling at Mika. "You have to learn to get yourself out of those situations." Mika looked up at her nervously, bemused at what her grandmom wanted from her. "Aim your waterfall beneath you and force yourself out," explained the 70-year-old as she gazed down at her 7-year-old granddaughter. "Grandmom, can you let me out now, please?" asked Yama uncertainly, the water lapping at his lips forebodingly. "I can't get." "Oh, be quiet, you," snapped Yoshino cantankerously, glaring at him for a moment before going back to the girl. "Come on, you. Don't let him be right about you. You are not a weakling," she growled, almost trying to scare her into doing it. Mika frowned as she tried to aim her waterfall power below her, concentration etched across her young features. Suddenly a thick pylon of water spurted out a few inches away from her face, making her cry out in fright, but Yoshino didn't flinch, impressing both her grandchildren. "Oh, come on," exclaimed the old woman, her eyes unscrunching a little to glower at the girl. "Aim, girl, aim." Mika knew her grandmom was grumpy, but she hadn't expected this from such an old and wrinkled thing, withered and stout, her tight bun sitting comfortably on the back of her gray head. The girl with the plum-colored hair closed her eyes and scrunched up her hazel eyes in concentration as she tried to get the waterfall to surge up just below her. She could feel a low rumbling just below her feet, she tried to force it to move closer to her knees and felt the ground below her crack and begin to give way. Before she knew what had happened, she was being pushed out of the ground and into the air, water splashing deliciously around her, keeping her afloat in the air. "Look, grandmom," she cried out gleefully, pride gushing through her not unlike the water around her as she bounced around on top of the jet of water, cool water. "Look at me. Look at your parents, Beppin," came the shaky voice from below her. Mika looked down and saw her mom pulling Yama out of his watery prison and her father smiling up at her proudly, surprise etched in his features as he held his hand up in front of his eyes, shading them from the sun. Her grandmom was smiling up at her as well, as though she had accomplished her goal for the week, and Yama was scowling moodily. The perfect end to a not-so-perfect day. Somewhere in the depths of Konoha, Rock Lee was listening intently to what the love of his life was telling him about the newcomer who had nearly killed her when all Sakura had ever done was be friendly. "And you are sure she wants to take Uchiha Sasuke away to Orochimaru?" asked the boy with the tidy bowl cut, frowning slightly as he registered what Sakura was telling him. Behind her Ino was nodding fervently, massaging an aching wrist and gazing at him intently through two black eyes. "Yes, Rock Lee," said Sakura tearfully, clutching the front of his skin-tight dark green jumpsuit. "And she wants to bring down the Hokage," she added desperately, tears rolling down her cheeks. Rock Lee closed his eyes for a moment, his hands balled into angry fists and his expression resolute. "I am a peaceful being," he started quietly, his eyes still closed as he worked up a sufficiently powerful aura around him. He didn't notice the pink-haired girl rolled her stunning green eyes in exasperation. "But when my true love is in peril and the village is in jeopardy," he snapped his eyes open and gazed over the top of Sakura's head, off in the distance. "Then I must prove myself," he finished dramatically, lifting his left fist up to shoulder level. "And this way, I can prove my love for Sakura in the most chivalrous way," he added to himself, winking discreetly. "I shall see you when I have defeated this fiend," he cried, looking at Sakura and then at Ino before dashing off in the direction Sakura had told him she had last seen them. "What a stuck-up jerk," said Ino when he was out of earshot as Sakura wiped away her crocodile tears and adopted a bitter expression. "Yeah, but he's gonna show Mika that I'm not to be messed with," she said venomously, still glaring off after Lee. "More than you did, anyway," she added, looking over her shoulder at Ino who glowered back. "At least it wasn't Sasuke who beat me up," she replied with a smug look on her pretty face. Sakura fumed, clenching her fists furiously as she tried desperately to find a decent comeback billboard brow. Added the blonde girl in an arrogantly satisfied tone. "So then Bishounen said that he hadn't even been there," explained Mika, moving her hands around energetically as she told Sasuke about her time in the Hidden Grass Village. "And then Nakura just took my hand and we just went back to the square and then she stopped herself. She didn't want Sasuke to know what they had done." Sasuke's smile disappeared. She had thought she was older then and so she had acted that age. She blushed awkwardly, terrified that Sasuke had guessed, which he probably had. I think you'd like him," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Nakura, I mean," she added. "Bishounen isn't really your type." She added, feeling as though the ground swallowing her up would be a more pleasant pastime than this awkward silence which had sneaked up on them and taken over. They sat in silence, not looking at each other, trying to think of something to say. Out of the corner of her eye, Mika noticed a boy in a green jumpsuit running towards them. He had pitch black hair cut into a shiny bowl cut, he had exceptionally bushy eyebrows, and his outfit left something to be desired. "Who's that?" asked Mika, nudging Sasuke, who had been inspecting his sandals. She indicated the boy who was swiftly approaching, and Sasuke sighed in annoyance. "That's Rock Lee," answered the dark-eyed boy, his expression that of intense boredom. "Doesn't anyone know the meaning of the word privacy in this village?" he asked himself, leaning his lower face on his entwined fingers as his elbows pressed into his knees. The boy had now slowed and was approaching them at a brisk walk, his face resolute and, despite the ridiculous eyebrows and hair, menacing. "Is he always this good-looking?" asked Mika under her breath, the hint of a joking smile in her soft voice. Sasuke looked at her with a small smile playing on his lips, but he lost it when he looked over her shoulder. "Are you the troublemaking newcomer?" asked the boy in a formal but strident voice. Mika turned to Sasuke inquiringly, before answering nervously. "I Mika, if that's what you're wondering." Rock Lee simply gazed at her intently, making her feel exceptionally uncomfortable. I hear you're Rock Lee. Cool name that," she said uneasily, trying to start up a polite conversation which might put an end to his ogling her. I like your She tried desperately to find something on him which she liked at least a little bit, but found it surprisingly difficult. "Leg warmers," she finished, trying to smile, but it came out a strange sort of nervous wince which reminded Sasuke of his own from earlier. "What have you been?" "You and I shall do battle," declared Rock Lee suddenly, relieving Mika of speaking, and yet she wasn't relieved. "Right here. Right now." He finished, taking a step back from the sidewalk Mika and Sasuke were sitting on and taking on a defensive stance. "Yes," started Mika quietly, trying to hide that she was completely thrown by this sudden urge of his for them to fight. Thing about that is she tried to find a decent excuse not to have to fight him, she knew she was no good at it. Sasuke she couldn't find one. She was stuffed. "How about later?" she asked with a pained smile, her shoulders lifting up around her neck as she tried to hide. "That is a very good idea," exclaimed the boy with the scary eyebrows. After a moment of reflection, Mika's eyes widened in surprise and relief. "I shall inform everyone, and we shall have a public battle," he continued, holding his fists up by his face. The pale color in Mika's face subsided in the blink of an eye as her heart sank and a look of terror replaced her rosy cheeks on her face. "Very honorable," finished the boy, staring at her again for a moment before he raced off to inform the rest of the village. "Great. I just find the guy of my dreams and I have to go and get myself killed in a dumb battle," thought Mika miserably as she watched her adversary dash off into the distance. So she started apprehensively, turning back to Sasuke, who was smiling at her pityingly. "Any bright ideas as to how I can survive this?" she asked imploringly. "Well," started Sasuke, looking off into the distance with a contemplating look. "How are you into jutsu?" he asked, looking at her inquiringly. "I'm doomed," she whimpered, curling herself up and putting her head between her knees wretchedly, where she rocked herself back and forwards, repeating the words I'm gonna die over and over again. Mika and Blue walked along the road side by side, chatting about how Yama was away again and what Mika could do to his bedroom. "You could take down any pictures he has up and replace them with girly stuff," suggested the 7-year-old boy, rubbing his nose as they walked past a fish stall. "You know, like the stuff Emiko used to have." "What sort of stuff did she have?" asked Mika, curiously looking over at her friend while holding her nose against the smell of fish. "And don't say girly stuff. I'm a girl," she added, looking at the stall on her other side and hitching her bag up a little higher on her shoulder. Pink stuff," answered Blue, trying to remember. "She took it all down a while ago," he continued, the frown creasing his forehead a little. Mika watched him intently. She loved watching him concentrate, it was the same when he was training. So intent on being as good as his brother. "Sorry, I said girly stuff, you don't have that sort of thing, do you?" "I did when I was little," admitted the girl as they turned a corner. "But I took it all down when I was tall enough to reach it. Mom gave all the pictures to me when I was a baby and they were all baby things." She waved at another kid from their class, the boy beside her scowled. "I don't like him," he told her under his breath, still glaring after the other boy who was being followed by a little white dog. "They're inferior to us," he added darkly. "What? Everyone in the village?" she asked curiously, gazing at her best friend inquisitively. "Why are they inferior?" she added, looking after the boy and his dog. She knew where they were heading, along with all the other kids of their age. "The academy." They're not as good as us. He answered as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. They're not in our league. They are not in our clan. He finished proudly. Mika snapped her head around to glare at him incredulously. What? She asked dangerously, stopping in her tracks. Blue stopped and looked at her uncomprehending. I'm not in your clan. Am I inferior? She asked angrily. The boy realized he was on thin ice and stayed quiet. You're starting to sound like your brother, she said quietly. The boy frowned at her. I didn't mean that, he said quietly, trying to keep his temper at bay. Then what did you mean? She asked, her own temper almost at boiling point. Just because someone isn't an Uchiha doesn't make them inferior to you. The dark-haired boy was about to answer when a jet of water suddenly crashed down between him and Mika, cutting them off from each other and covering his voice with the noise. Around them, kids on their way to the academy were stopping and staring, pointing and whispering, well, not whispering, but talking so that he couldn't hear them, which wasn't difficult. Mika, he started, but his voice was drowned out, but the wall of water between him and the girl. He frowned and ran around the side, trying to get around it, but he soon realized that the wall of water was in fact slowly circling around her, making it impossible for him to see her. Mika, please. Suddenly a small gap appeared, and there was the brown-eyed girl frowning at him. What? She asked furiously. Because I'm in a clan too, I'm superior to everyone else. Or because I'm your friend? She asked skeptically, but she didn't let him answer. The small gap closed up and the water began to move in the direction of the academy, with Mika inside. Wow. She's so cool. The boy with the steely blue eyes turned around and saw various kids of about the same age as him, all watching in awe as the 5-meter-high wall of water moved slowly away, their eyes wide and their mouths open. Mika had been practicing her taijutsu with Sasuke for 3 hours when a small kid with brown hair and what looked like a towel for a cape came running up to them. Are you Mika Tikik? He asked in a slightly raspy voice from running. Mika's heart sank. She was being summoned. She nodded nervously. You're fighting Rock Lee in 15 minutes in the stadium, he told her, staring at her mercilessly. She tried to take a deep breath but choked and spluttered nervously before falling to her knees in despair. He's gonna destroy me, she whimpered, hiding her face in her hands desolately. Sasuke knelt down beside her and patted her on the back reassuringly, motioning to the messenger to vamoose. Why is he gonna destroy you? Asked the boy curiously, refusing to go away. Sasuke glowered at him threateningly, but Mika looked up at him sadly. Because he's a master of taijutsu, she started to explain, her face sadly resolute. And I suck at taijutsu, she continued. She looked tired and her eyes were full of despairing determination, as though she knew that this was her destiny and she'd see it through till the end. I'm better in genjutsu. She finished brushing her plum-colored hair out of her eyes. Well, why don't you use genjutsu then? Asked the boy, shrugging as though it was obvious. Mika looked up at him as though he was a retard, opened her mouth and shut it a couple of times before deciding to stop, her expression that of hope. Why didn't I think of that? She asked herself aloud, gazing off into the distance, looking at nothing in particular. The boy crossed his arms smugly. She looked back up at the boy in ecstatic joy. What's your name? Konohamaru, he answered, holding his head up haughtily. Mika got up, took the boy's face in her hands, and placed her lips gently on his cheek for a second before pulling away and running off in the direction of the stadium, leaving the honorable grandson standing there with a wide-eyed gloomy look on his face and Sasuke glaring at him before he ran off after Mika. They arrived at the stadium with a minute to spare. Mika had butterflies but was prepared to go in. She wasn't going down without a fight. Sasuke was giving her tips on her opponent's weaknesses since he had already fought against him, but Mika was repeating words under her breath, not listening to him. When the time came, she stood up with a determined look on her pretty face, her fists clenched in their gloves, she checked her shuriken holster and her kunai knives and walked out. As the sun hit her face, she heard a great rumble of clapping and whooping from the crowds, making her feel self-conscious. She looked around and saw that most of the shady side was full and a few rows were full on the sunny side. She searched around for someone she knew but couldn't see anyone. On the other side of the stadium she saw Rock Lee coming out, looking around and then starting to ogle her again. Mika's heart was racing painfully in her chest as she walked forwards to the center, where a man was standing, ready to referee the fight. She looked him up and down once and then, as she got closer, fixed on his face. He had dark brown hair, dark eyes, and a scar which ran over his nose and below both eyes. Mika's knees went weak as he smiled reassuringly at her. Her heart was still pumping painfully in her chest, but it missed a couple of beats when he said hi in a cool, casual voice. My name's Iruka, and I'll be your referee for today, he said politely, his voice businesslike. Mika smiled dreamily at him, almost forgetting what was in store for her. Hiya, Lee, added the man, smiling at Rock Lee. Mika glared at her opponent, feeling a gush of jealousy as Iruka smiled at her foe. I'm about to fight the biggest battle since the Chunin exam, and the referee just has to be a hottie. She thought furiously as she regained control over her legs. "Keep this fight clean, okay?" said the man with the brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. He raised his hand in the air, looking from Mika to Lee and back again before bringing it down again quickly while shouting, "Fight." Mika threw herself back as hard as she could, getting enough distance between her and her adversary, but he was following her. She backflipped even further, but saw that he was airborne. She crouched down and let him fly over her head only inches away from her scalp. She heard a collective intake of breath from the crowd as she ran in the opposite direction, trying desperately to get some distance between her and the boy with the scary hair. She turned around and as she had expected there he was, tailing her. She managed to do a quick hand movement. Horse, Tiger Lee was thrown backwards far enough to give Mika enough time to do her favorite jutsu. Brass element. Hidden deer jutsu. She cried as she moved her hands, closing her eyes and swiftly putting them into snake, horse, dragon, dog, tiger, snake and boar, holding the boar as she opened her eyes again. As she had expected, there were about 16 other images of her standing in various places, all every now and then shimmering like a bad TV screen. She did a quick snake sign and watched herself flicker just like the others, confusing Lee into thinking that she was just one of the illusions. Rock Lee ran at the pack of Mikas and started kicking around in them, but his feet just went straight through them. He came straight at the real Mika, making her heart miss another beat as he threw his fist out to punch her, but she put her hand into snake and his fist went straight through her face, followed by his whole body, as though she was made of smoke. She turned around and saw him attacking another of her illusions. She spun around and hit him squarely in the back of the head with her left foot, making him fly forwards and land on the ground, rubbing the back of his neck and scowling up at the many Mikas, some of which blew a kiss to him provocatively. Periodically the illusions would fizzle for a moment before becoming whole again, adding to the effect of trickery, and Mika had to remember to make a discreet snake sign to give the impression that she was also an illusion. Before Mika could catch her breath, Lee was up again and trying to work out what to do. The girl who was controlling all her semblances ran forwards, making 7 others run forwards at the same time, and before she got to him, she made herself shimmer to trick him into thinking that she was a clone, making sure the others didn't, and then threw out a fist to hit him squarely in his nose, which proceeded to bleed. But she'd made a mistake. She'd released the boar sign which held the illusions in existence. She quickly moved backwards and started a different technique, but Rock Lee was onto her now and threw himself at her, blood still trickling down his chin and onto his green jumpsuit, which was still freaking Mika out. Mika held him off reasonably well, moving 2 limbs at a time which let her keep up with him, but less balance. She stepped backwards and tripped on a stray stone, falling backwards onto her back. Before she had had time to get up, Lee was standing above her and had grabbed her by her deep purple top and was picking her up. He threw her high into the air where she floated for a moment before feeling herself start to fall. Suddenly she realized he was below her. She felt a small change in the air on her right and guessed that he was about to kick her on the left. She hoped to goodness she was right because she curled herself around on her left, perfect for protecting that side, but her back was completely unprotected. She caught his leg as it zoomed towards her stomach on the left side and managed to twist herself around by using his motion and landed heavily on the ground. She looked up and found a knee heading straight for her face. As it made contact with her lower face, she squealed in terror and pain before being thrown back several yards. She opened her eyes and pressed her hands to her mouth, where she was sure he had broken at least 5 teeth, but she didn't have time to check. Lee was in the air again, ready to punch her again with all the force that his descent was giving him. Mika ripped open her shuriken holster and yanked out 3 which she threw up at him, growling in frustration. Lee dodged a shuriken and was about to land when he noticed the kunai knives she had in her hands. He landed just beside her, trying to miss them, but she jumped up and slashed them diagonally at him with both hands. He leapt back, but she slid through his jumpsuit, making it hang open at the front, showing his bare chest which was surprisingly toned. The 2 teens stood for a moment, about 3 yards apart, watching each other intently, trying to work out what the other's next move would be, breathing deeply. Mika's fear had subsided now. She was tired and perspiring from the effort, but Rock Lee seemed not to have broken a sweat, only adrenaline was keeping her going now. She glanced up at the crowd, her chest heaving and her hands trembling. She looked for a familiar face, but only found that of Sakura and Ino, who were both glaring at her. She looked back down at Rock Lee, who was still watching her, standing at about 45 degrees to her, but his face was glued to her. Disappointment was coursing through her worn-out body now. She didn't know why, but she had expected to see someone there, watching her fight, rooting for her. Maybe she wanted to see Iruka smiling down at her, but he wasn't there. Maybe she missed her friends back in the hidden grass village. Suddenly she had an idea. She was about to do a different jutsu, but before she could even start the hand movements, Lee had started running at her again. He jumped up into the air and spun around with his leg out, aiming for Mika's head. Water style. Water wall. She cried, her hands fumbling into tiger, snake and tiger, her voice trembling as Lee's foot came closer and closer, but just before the impact a wall of water sprang up between them. From the stands, Sasuke's heart leapt as he saw the wall of water crashing in front of Mika for the first time in so long, but then he saw her hands in the tiger sign. It was just a jutsu. Lee was thrown back by the water, but picked himself up and launched the same attack as the water receded into the ground, along with a vast amount of Mika's chakra. She stood panting for a moment before doing her grass village jutsu again, but this time she only had enough chakra for 6 illusions, which all fizzled quietly. 6 tired-looking Mikas, all with their hands stuck in the boar sign, all glaring at Rock Lee rebelliously, all with heaving chests as she tried to catch her breath. She did the snake sign and let her body fizzle quietly, the sensation resembling pins and needles. Lee was throwing himself around through the illusions, kicking them and hitting, but his feet and hands just went straight through them as though they weren't there. He let his legs slip through the illusion closest to Mika, and she suddenly saw him coming straight at her. She held her breath as she did the snake sign, but her chakra was very low, and she wasn't entirely insubstantial. She winced as she felt his legs slide through her stomach, feeling as though someone had just tugged a steel slab through her. Rock Lee noticed that and turned around to give her a second kick, and this time she was almost completely solid. She let her clones fade into nothingness as she focused all her chakra on her stomach, which her opponent was trying to force his leg through with increasing difficulty. Mika screamed out in pain as she felt herself become solid again, her whole body other than the thin band where Lee was pushing his leg through. "Get out." She screamed at him as she realized she could no longer hold it. "Get your leg out." She bellowed as Lee's leg stopped moving, his face anxious. Mika gritted her teeth in excruciating pain as her flesh closed in on the boy's ankle. She tried to hold it off, but her chakra was so used up. "Listen, you win. Just get your leg out of my stomach, please." She cried out in agony as Lee wrenched his leg out of her almost completely consistent stomach. She fell onto her now fully solid stomach and lay there panting, her eyes closed tight as she felt footsteps running swiftly over. She opened her deep brown eyes and looked over at Rock Lee, who was still glaring at her, and smiled. "I guess you won." She panted, trying to push herself up and failing miserably. "But you could have trapped me," said the boy with the bowl cut, still watching her avidly. "You could have won. It would have hurt," she told him, closing her eyes again as the footsteps came closer. "Me as well as you, it's not pleasant having someone else's leg inside you." She winced as her stomach throbbed agonizingly. She could hear voices all around her now, unfamiliar voices shouting worried things at unseen faces, the footsteps so close Mika might have been worried they were going to step on her, but she was too worn out. She could hear her name being called, but it sounded like it was miles away. She could feel someone turning her over and picking her upper body up. "Mika? Mika, can you hear me?" came the voice, echoing around her. She tried to open her eyes, but found it laboriously difficult. She managed to lift her heavy eyelids, and a face swam in front of her eyes, a familiar face, the dark hair falling down towards her, his dark eyes fearful. "Did I look stupid?" she asked as the face swimming in front of her as she tried to control her eyes, which were trying desperately to roll back into her head. "You were the best," came the voice again, as the face began to clear up and Mika noticed a familiar smile. She smiled as she realized who it was, the proximity making them both a little awkward, but a decent excuse for it made it okay. "Thanks Sasuke," she whispered, letting her eyes close, letting herself sink into his arms and letting herself sink into oblivion. The boy smiled at his friend as they walked along the dirt road towards her family's hamlet, but they weren't heading there. Before they got to the large wooden gates, they came off the path and headed into the cool green woods, feeling the crunching of old autumn leaves from years gone by. They had been told by someone that there was a river where they could swim not far inside the forest, and today they would be alone, no one would be there. They were all at the academy. "What are we gonna tell Iruka-sensei?" asked a girl with a mischievous smile to her best friend. The boy smirked at her sideways but didn't answer. They both giggled, not wanting to have to answer that. Neither knew what on earth they were going to tell him. "We could forge a sick note," suggested the boy uncertainly, scratching the side of his face as the girl dodged a tree. She winced a little. "Both of us?" she asked, looking over at him with a skeptical expression. "He'll never believe us. We're always together, he'd be suspicious," she continued, striking out that idea. There was another long, comfortable pause as they continued to meander further and further into the forest. "Did he say turn right at the fat tree or was it left?" asked the boy as they approached a very stout-looking tree which was right in the middle of the tiny woody path. The girl pulled her hair out of her eyes and shrugged, wincing a little as she tried to remember. The boy smiled and chuckled exasperatedly. "We'll turn right," he declared, heading off in that direction. The girl followed. A few minutes later they were back again, scratched and a little bruised, but giggling as they went past the fat tree and in the other direction. "Are we nearly there yet?" asked Mika, smiling at her friend as they continued walking along the wood path. The boy spluttered a laugh and looked at her incredulously as she burst out laughing as well. They giggled crazily, and for no apparent reason they started running, taking each other's hands as they did so. Soon enough the still giggling children arrived at the edge of a river, but the weeds floating around in it looked foreboding and unpleasant. Mika grimaced at her friend who returned the look. "Don't worry," reassured the boy, smiling at Mika who was still wrinkling her nose at the river. He said that it was better a bit further down. He told her, stroking her hand. "Well, let's go then," she cried, tugging on his hand as she dashed off downstream. They leapt over small bushes and brambles, ducked under low-hanging branches, dodged trees and other things blocking their path, finally arriving at a clearing where a small dusty beach led down to a small ford-like area where they could swim without being washed away by the current. There was so much color in the different greens, the different shadow effects dancing off leaves and the water which was a beautiful shimmering azure. The dusty beach was almost sparkling in the soft sunlight which was filtering through the dense canopy, shining in subtle greens and gold. Mika turned and grinned at the boy ecstatically before running out into the clearing and starting to pull off her top, revealing a light blue swimming costume. When she'd taken her clothes off she turned back to look expectantly at her friend who still hadn't moved. She shrugged, an perplexed look on her pretty face, waiting for him to move, but he was just watching her quietly, making her feel excruciatingly self-aware. He snapped back to reality and hastily tugged off his shirt as she turned back around and started to step gingerly into the cold clear water. Behind her she heard the sand crunching beneath her friend's toes as he made his way towards her and then the soft splashing of his foot hitting the water. "The RRR, it's cold," exclaimed the girl looking over her shoulder at Blue who was catching up to her as the water reached her knees. She grinned cheesily and rubbed her upper arms as though she was freezing. He returned her grin as he tiptoed closer to her while she waited patiently, holding out her hand. He took it and they waded in until they both had the water up to their torsos, where they grinned at each other sheepishly. "We gonna do it then?" asked the boy, his face apprehensive of the freezing water lapping at both their chests. Mika glanced at the water before looking back at her friend and nodded enthusiastically. Their hands squeezed each other nervously before letting their knees buckle and their small bodies be submerged quickly into the icy stream. They came back up again, taking a large gulp of breath each and gritting their teeth against the low temperature and groaning, almost in pain. "We're crazy, we shouldn't be doing this, we're gonna catch pneumonia," cried Mika as she shivered uncontrollably, the grin still fixed in place, but her eyes tightly shut. "We're gonna die," she finished, giggling, and the boy joined in too. "Come here," said the boy through chattering teeth, holding his arms out for her to cuddle up into, which she did, wrapping her arms around his waist as they crouched in the cold water, still shivering, but the grins were also there. Part 1 ends here. I hope you guys liked it. On 200 likes and 50 comments, final part will be uploaded. Till then you guys can watch this video. It's time to say you guys, sayonara.